I downloaded Tinder because I was really bored and honestly I was quite lonely. This was just last year when the whole COVID thing finally started to die down a little bit. I'd actually used Tinder once before this and I've met some pretty decent people off the app. Nothing special though, nor out of the ordinary. The last time I used Tinder and the last time I'll ever use a dating app again, I met this blonde girl named Haley. She seemed okay at first, hence why I met up with her in the first place. I thought she was cute and I just really wanted someone to connect with. We seemed to really hit it off, so that's when we decided we should meet up. Let me just tell you now that shit hit the fan and got absolutely crazy. You hear horror stories all the time about people meeting up with strangers from the internet that you never really seem to pay much attention to. Because, well, you think that things like this don't happen often, and the likelihood of it happening to you is slim to none. Well, that's how I thought anyways. I figured we would just go out to eat, or maybe catch a movie or something, but she wanted to come to my house instead. As a matter of fact, she insisted. I made up an excuse as to why we couldn't hang out at my place. Really, it was because my house was a mess, and also I just wanted to get out of the house myself anyways. She very bluntly explained to me that we couldn't hang out unless we were to hang out at my house. Look, I know I should have saw this as a red flag, and I think part of me did, but I didn't pay enough attention to it. She was really pretty, and I was lonely. I think she definitely used that to her advantage, because she knew it too. I eventually caved in, and I told her that she could come over. So we set up a time for her to come, and that gave me just enough time to clean the house and to shower and get myself ready. She texted me when she got here, and I let her in. It was extremely awkward at first, and right away I thought that she looked a little different from the picture she had on her Tinder account. I couldn't tell if I was just overthinking or not, and I didn't say anything at first about it because I didn't want to be rude. I'm not all that attractive anyway, so I just kind of let it go, and we started chatting. Things were going okay, and then she asked me if I had anything to drink, alcohol-wise. And I told her I had about a half-fifth of Jameson left in the cupboard. I excused myself to the restroom, and when I came back, she was sitting on the couch with her drink in her hand. And I saw that she had prepared a drink for me as well that was sitting on my glass coffee table. I really wasn't in the mood for alcohol, especially not liquor, so I grabbed a beer out of my fridge and drank that instead. About 3 or 4 beers later, I ended up drinking my mixed drink that she kept pressuring me to drink. In fact, I almost completely decided against drinking it just because of how bad she wanted me to. I had a paranoid OCD-like thought that it was certainly possible that she could have spiked my drink with something while I was using the bathroom. And I had a serious feeling to stay away from the drink she made me altogether. But I let it go eventually because the drunker I got, the more I realized how delusional I sounded to myself. She seemed like a nice girl and we were getting along just fine. Plus, it didn't seem like there was anything in my drink, so I figured it was okay. Anyways, I drank it, and I didn't feel much different until maybe about 10 or 20 minutes afterwards. But I just played it off as me being drunk and overthinking. After all, I am a lightweight, and 6 drinks is way more than enough to keep me pretty messed up. This is where things start to get really weird. The last thing I remember was we were sitting on the couch, and I started feeling very strange. I started to feel fainty and very dizzy until I ultimately passed out completely. I had to have been out cold for at least 5 hours because I woke up at the ass crack of dawn and what I discovered was nothing short of a nightmare. I was lying on my bedroom floor and I awoke in a terrified state of mind. I slowly started to piece together that something was horribly wrong and I was still feeling weird from the drugs she had roofied me with. The first thing I noticed was that my whole entire body was in serious pain. All the way from my neck to my arms and my back and my stomach too. I had bruises all over me and I had over 5 serious stab-like puncture wounds, along with deep cuts in both of my arms and my stomach. I got up and I saw that my bed and that the floor in my room was soaked with blood and the walls as well. I about fainted again when I saw this and I remember feeling like I couldn't breathe. I went to grab my phone to call the police, but I couldn't find it. Turned out that she had stole my phone and all 4 of my TVs that were in my house. along with some jewelry and some of my safes that had over $20,000 in it. I looked all around my house, but nobody was in sight. My house was a complete wreck though, as she destroyed windows, vandalized just about every room, and she just completely demolished everything. I remember looking in the mirror at one point and having a complete breakdown. I couldn't believe that any of this was real. I'm almost 100% positive that there was somebody else other than the girl that I met that was in on this. It's hard for me to even type this out, but my stomach had a really disturbing wound, in which they used my blood to draw a pentagram on the wall of my bedroom with. I found one of my old phones in my dresser, and I plugged it into the charger, and I connected it to the Wi-Fi so I could call a friend on FaceTime audio, so they could get the cops out to my house, and I just waited for them to show up. It was probably about 20 minutes, if that. I don't know what the hell she drugged me with exactly, but it was reported as some sort of rare, extremely powerful tranquilizer. I gave all the information I could to the police, and I logged into my Tinder account on my old phone in hopes that the account would still be there so I could show the police, but of course, they unmatched me and probably deleted the account. Not that it would have helped much anyways, because I'm pretty sure I was catfished. They never caught the people who did this. I actually moved to a new house a couple of months back, and I don't live in as much fear now. I also have security cameras, and I have an ADT security alarm system set up now too, which I recommend everybody has if possible. It could save your life.
I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending that we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. By now we were in high school. One day we decided we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country. We were exploring and trying to find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers and even discovered bridges no one went to. We fished, we hid from trains, and at night we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times. Never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went on our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits, so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our old trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix, so soon we decided to take a day to walk the trails and camp one night and then walk home. The day finally came, and we started out early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside of our hometown. She thought this was an absolutely crazy idea and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun, and a little sad even, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to settle in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had bought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill or something and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from the top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet. No movement could be seen. no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a small, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place and was also weathered black. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside, and there were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and we went back up the hill to our spot we had picked for camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to be the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. You hear that? What the hell is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. But it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but maybe in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was getting ready to say, "Let's just get the heck out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out very well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran to the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back, and we saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and we came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down it, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods.
I made one of the most idiotic decisions I have ever made a few years back that ultimately led me straight to a downright horrible and absolutely barbaric situation with someone that I presume is honestly a serial killer or even worse potentially. I'm a 21-year-old girl, and this took place about 3 years ago to be exact. I was 18 at the time, and I had just graduated high school. It was the middle of August, and it was a relatively boring day. Up until this point, my summer vacation was extremely boring. My dad and I lived alone, and he was extremely protective of me. So much that he was abusive to me emotionally and psychologically. He wouldn't let me have any friends whatsoever. And every day I had to stay home to either help him with chores around the house or pretty much to be his personal slave. He even took my bedroom door off the hinges to make me feel completely powerless. He never let me have an ounce of privacy, until he finally got me a phone, that is, which was about a month before this all took place. He would usually take my phone at 8 o'clock every night, but he was extremely drunk this night, and he didn't get home from the bar until after 10 o'clock or so. I guess he forgot, either that or he thought I was asleep, so he didn't bother. I'm not sure. Probably a mixture of both. I had Tinder on my phone, and I used that as an escape to meet new people and to socialize. Through all my years of isolation, I was never really able to meet any good friends. Most of the kids at my school either pretended to be my friend, or just flat out picked on me and did their best to make my life a living hell. I had been talking to this guy who we'll call Alex for this story, on Tinder for just over a day, and our friendship progressed pretty quick. I had to be careful though, because my dad would snoop through everything in my phone, so I had to delete anything on it that my dad would not be okay with every night before giving him my phone, which 100% included Tinder. He would have killed me if he knew I was on there. Anyways, this guy I was talking to was 28 years old, and at the time, him being much older attracted me and it boosted my confidence that an older man was talking to me. But looking back, even just a few years ago, I can see how it was definitely kind of creepy of him to be talking to someone my age. Anyways, I sort of told him about my situation at home, and he said that I could come live with him. He reminded me that I'm an adult now, and legally I don't have to abide by my father anymore. I was extremely excited by this, but also terrified. He told me that he could pick me up tonight and that I should get my things ready. I told him that I really wasn't ready for that yet, and that I just wanted to hang out for now, and I asked him if that was okay, to which he agreed. He told me he would be there to pick me up at midnight, and I said okay. I told him that I needed to be back home by 4 a.m., and he said that was okay too. I also told him not to drive down my driveway and to just park on the side of the road, and to text me when he's here and that I'll just come out. My dad's house had kind of a long driveway, and I was scared that my dad would somehow hear him pulling up and wake up, so I figured him parking further away would be much safer for us. He then told me that he preferred to talk over text, and so he asked me for my number. I gave it to him, but I told him that on any other normal night, unless prompted otherwise, to not text me after 8 o'clock. He already knew about my dad, so he agreed. Sure enough, Alex showed up like 5 minutes past 12 o'clock, and he texted me to let me know he was outside like I asked him to. I texted him back and said that I'll be out in just a few minutes. I snuck out of my window and I started making my way down the driveway, and I didn't see any sign of Alex. Like I said before, my dad has a decently long-sized driveway, and each side has a bunch of trees that outline the entirety of the driveway, all the way down to the end of the road by the mailbox. I thought it was weird because I figured I would see a light coming from his car or something, but I think I just figured he had his car turned off to be more low-key and less suspicious since he knew about my dad. As I was walking down the driveway, I was probably about halfway to the road. I started to hear some whispering. I sat there for a moment just observing, and then I heard a man burst out in laughter, then quiet down really quickly again, and then the whispering continued. I started walking again, ever so softly, and I made it within probably 20 feet of who I thought to be was Alex. I could finally start to hear what was being said. I came to the conclusion that he was on the phone because he was having a conversation, but nobody was speaking back from what I could hear. Now, I can admit I was eavesdropping, and this isn't something I would normally do, but given the circumstances of the situation, I'm pretty sure you could understand why I had my guard up so high. And I'm extremely glad I did, because I would probably be dead right now if I hadn't. And that's when I heard the most sickening and disturbing thing I've ever heard in my entire life. He began bragging to whoever he was on the phone with about how he was waiting for me and how he was going to rape the shit out of me, and I quote, "keep me alive for as long as possible." I literally almost puked when I heard this, and I made a bit of ruckus apparently, because right after, Alex seemingly became eerily and abruptly quiet. I thought about running back inside, but I thought I had a better chance of just hiding. I ran back in the direction I came from, towards the house, and I took a hard right into the woods, and I hid in this spot that I knew about. I figured I would be safe for now. About 5 minutes had passed, and not a single noise came about. Then I got a text. It was from Alex. "Where are you?" he asked. I obviously ignored it, and then I turned my ringer off. He then began blowing my phone up with messages and calls until I finally picked up after probably the 5th time of him calling me. I thought it would be a much better idea to answer the phone and to come up with a lie and make an excuse about how I can't come tonight and how I'm really sorry and that we should hang out another time. He didn't buy it though. I think he knew I was on to him. He started getting extremely angry with me and tried to make me feel bad by telling me I wasted his time, and that's when his true colors came out. He started cussing me out and telling me about how horrible I am and how no guy will ever love me and that sort of thing. And then he said something that truly frightened me to my core. "I know where you live, just remember that. I hope you sleep tight, honey. I'll see you soon." And then he hung up. Almost right after that, I heard a car turn on and speed off, and that was thankfully the last time I heard from him. I really wanted to keep the peace because he knew where I lived, and I was just hoping he would stay away after this. I lied awake all night in bed, wondering if he was going to come back or not, and I was terrified he was going to kill me. I blocked him on Tinder and from my phone number as well, and I called my grandma the very next morning while my dad was at work, and I told her what happened. I completely confided in her about my dad and told her about how horrible he had been to me my whole life. She came and picked me up, and we didn't tell my dad anything at all about what happened. My grandma always knew my dad was horrible, but she never knew truly just how bad he was to me at home. I was too scared to tell anyone about it for the longest of time, but it was truly the best decision I've ever made. I've since been much happier, and I'm working on getting my own place with my girlfriend. Life has been moving along, and I've been healing and getting better each day. I tried to contact the police, but they told me they couldn't do anything without any proof, so I knew I was screwed. It's more than likely that Alex is still out there hurting others, if that's even his real name. When I was in college, I pondered the idea of trying out some dating apps like Bumble and Tinder for no reason other than to meet new people and to cure some of my own boredom. I matched with someone I recognized from high school named Claire. We spoke very little about anything really. We only briefly talked about how it was a coincidence that we never spoke before. We had the same group of friends in high school, and our school was relatively small, so I suppose it was kind of weird that we barely knew each other. Conversation very quickly turned into her asking me if I wanted to hang out that night. I was stoked, so of course I said yes, all while trying not to sound overly excited about it. You know, I kind of thought that it was weird that she wanted to hang out so quickly, especially at night, but I hardly questioned it, and I didn't want to ruin my chances. She asked me to come over and told me I could come by anytime after 11 o'clock. She told me that she would be alone and that I should try to bring weed if I could. I didn't smoke, but I knew friends that did, so I showed up with $10 worth of some pretty shitty looking weed, hoping that it would be good enough for her. Looking back, I should have been more wary, and I at least should have told someone I was close with where I was going, because little did I know I was in for an extremely messed up situation. But my 20-year-old curious virgin brain ran rapid with the endless possibilities of me having a lucky night. I think I kind of liked the idea of not knowing what was going to happen, but I never would have thought in a million years that what happened would happen. On my way there, I was excited, and I turned on some music, and I was singing in my car practically the whole way there. As I started to get closer, probably only 2 minutes away, I started to get a weird feeling, as I didn't really recognize the area, and that's when my anxiety kicked in a little bit. When I pulled into the neighborhood, I saw that it was a very run-down area, and I started to question if I was in the wrong location. But the address she gave me matched up with where I was, so I continued driving until I stumbled upon her house. I felt my heart drop to my stomach when I saw the house that she gave me the address to. I'm telling you right now, I knew deep down for a fact that something wasn't right. There was something so off about the house and area I was in general. The house was extremely dark, and the only light coming from it was an inside light that was upstairs. I rolled down my foggy tinted window so I could get a better view, and I told myself there was no way I was going to walk up to the house. It literally looked abandoned. I started to drive away, and less than a minute later I received a notification on Tinder from Claire that asked where I was going and to come back. I told her I thought I had the wrong house, and she told me I was wrong about my presumption, and she told me to come back once again. I seriously didn't want to, and I had a horrible feeling about it, but I also wanted it to not be a setup so bad that I foolishly went back. I asked her if she would come outside when I get there, and she called me a wimp and told me that she was just finishing up getting ready and that the door was unlocked and that I can just let myself in. Still to this day, I'm embarrassed by how stupid it was of me to actually follow through with what she said, but I did. I parked the car on the side of the road and I began walking up to the porch. I knocked on the door to let myself be known, and I opened it. I walked in slowly, and right away I could tell that the house was disgusting. It was extremely dark, but from what I could see, it was a mess and really vile looking. I heard some music coming from upstairs, and I saw a light up there as well, so I followed it. "Hello? Claire, I'm here," I said. The closer I got, the more I could make out the music. There was some sort of death metal or black metal music playing, which really freaked me out, honestly, even more. It just added to the creepy and eerie vibe of everything. I finally made it up the stairs, and I saw there was only 2 rooms, one of which was the bathroom that had the light off, and I looked in there and there was nobody. I then pointed my direction at the other door where the music was coming from, but it didn't really look like the bedroom had a light on or anything inside. That's when my anxiety turned to fear, and I really began questioning my choices of how I wound up in this situation. Then the music stopped. I heard a bunch of footsteps walking around on the hardwood tile before me in the room, and people were talking. And then I heard a loud scream come from the bedroom that jump scared me so bad I almost fell down the stairs. Finally, my senses hit me and I realized it was time to leave and how dangerous of a situation I was in. I turned around to run down the stairs, and that's when I saw some guy dressed in black that had gothic makeup on and long dark hair. Almost simultaneously, the door behind me upstairs also opened. "Ethan, hey, it's Claire. I'm glad you could make it," she said. I turned around and I saw that it definitely wasn't Claire from school and that I was 100% being catfished. Then the guy downstairs started walking quickly up the stairs in my direction. "Okay guys, this isn't funny anymore. Please just leave me alone." And they both started laughing and started calling me names. I knew my only option was to fight or to run, so I thought running would be the first best option. I ran into the bathroom and I managed to shut and lock the door before they could get to me. They both started banging on the door and twisting the doorknob profusely, extremely hard, and told me to let them in. I looked all around for something I could use to act as a weapon, and the next best thing I could find was a toothbrush. I knew that wasn't going to help much, but I figured it was better than nothing. I could stab them in the neck or the eye with it if I really had to, and it came down to it. I started panicking even more when I fully realized the severity of the situation I was in. I opened the shower curtain and I saw there was a window that looked pretty small, but I had to try my luck. It was pretty much my only option at this point. I opened the window and I managed to fit through it, and just as I landed on the roof, I almost slipped and fell to the ground. Luckily I didn't though, and I caught myself. I made my way around the house while still on the roof as I was looking for the safest way down, and I managed to find a trampoline in the backyard that I could jump on to get the hell out of there. I ran like hell all the way to my car, and there wasn't a sign of either of them. They didn't chase me down or anything. I drove away and I called the cops and gave them all the information I had to give. I told them I was driving home and I gave them the address of the place, and the police later stopped by my house that night to tell me what they discovered and so I could make a better statement. Apparently, the people who were setting me up were a group of people in some sort of black metal band that killed innocent people by luring them off of dating apps like Tinder by using a pretty girl as a catfish. In the house, which was abandoned by the way, the police discovered 2 dead bodies of 2 girls that were my age and tons of blood. think the police actually caught 2 of the murder suspects, but are still looking for the rest of them, and apparently the group called themselves Holy Eternity or something like that. These people are really messed up, and I was almost murdered that night. I've never touched a dating app since, and I don't think I ever will.
So I own this property in the countryside of Alabama. It's in the middle of nowhere with 60 plus acres. It has an abandoned house, barn, and greenhouse. The barn and house are close to each other, and the greenhouse is far into the woods. Me and my friend were setting up our film equipment in the house because we were going to film a video the next day. My friend wakes up and tells me he's getting really weird feelings about all of this, so we go to sleep in my truck. I fall asleep when we get in the truck, and my friend is still awake. He told me it was around 4 in the morning, and he saw 7 to 8 people in hoods and robes. He said they looked around the house for a bit, probably to see if anyone was there because they saw our equipment in my truck. One of the guys stared directly at my friend in the car, but my windows are tinted, so the guy had a hard time seeing my friend. The guy stops investigating my truck and goes back with the group. My friend tried to wake me up, but I wouldn't. The morning came and my friend was still very sleepy from not catching sleep. And we went into the house to check on everything. The lights are smashed, papers are burned, umbrellas are broken. We found candles around the house and a cat nailed to a wall with a pentagram around it. We found decayed animals, 2 dogs, some horses, some cattle, birds, a bat, and some kind of hand buried. Since this place was once farmland, I just assumed the previous owners just left the animals to die or something, but I didn't know how to explain the bat, birds, and hand. This stuff was found near the barn and in the barn. So one day we come back to see if there's any more weird shit going on, and we find 3 pigs on crosses near the house. The pigs were decapitated and the heads were on the ground in front of them. They were wearing makeup and they had wigs sewn into their heads. My friend tells me he thinks the people he saw the last time we were there did it, and he was telling me he thought they might be a satanic cult or some weird group. Around the crosses and pigs, some parts of the ground was burned, a few large circles. We spent the rest of our day taking down the pigs and burying them in the woods. We go here again to ride some dirt bikes and ATVs, and nothing weird was there when we came. We put them in the barn because we would come back later in the week. My friend's putting up his ATV and tells me he saw a person in the barn, just relaxing on some hay. But it was in the dark, in one of those horses or cattle stalls. My friend stood there for a while to see if it was a person, and the man moved his hand in a goodbye kind of way. My friend runs out of the barn and tells me what happens. I go in there because I thought my friend was just bullshitting me, but no one was in there. Then when I'm leaving the barn, I see the guy trying to sleep on the 2nd story, and I ask if he's alright, and he tells me he is, and to just go away and let him sleep. Even though it's my property, I didn't want to start any shit with him, so I let him be. We end up thinking that he is part of the group that's been doing stuff on my property. We go there again about 2 weeks later, and we see from my truck the guy walking out of the barn and talking to 2 guys. One of them point to my truck and they all run into the woods. I get my knife and gun. I keep it under my seat, and finally it came in use. We then go to the guys to tell them that they can't come here anymore and that it's my property. I can't find them, but we found that most of them stay inside the greenhouse. We found clothes, books, and dead birds and squirrels, and I'm assuming that's what they ate. There was a pond nearby, so that's probably what they bathed in, or maybe they didn't bathe at all. We go to the barn to investigate some more, and we found books on the 2nd story, an altar, and some tall candles. All of this was out of sight from the ground. We also found stuff like rope, knives, nails, a hammer, and a mallet. We conclude that all of those guys there are in the group, and they did all this weird shit. We have not been on that property for months now, so we don't know if they're still there or moved on. The police have searched there before for 2 guys that kidnapped a 9-year-old too, so those guys might be blamed for that. The police found no one though.
Earlier this spring, I was camping in the woods 4 hours north of where I live. There was a small lake that I'd go to a lot. It was never crowded, or even really known about, I don't think, so it made for a nice peaceful getaway every time I went. When I got there on the first day and set everything up, nobody else was there. The lake wasn't too big and was surrounded by a grassy beach, with the woods around it, so I could see pretty much all around the lake. Not too long after I arrived, I saw a man come out of the woods on the other side and set up a tent. He looked like an average camper and was keeping to himself for the first little while. Before sundown, though, I saw him making his way around the lake and over toward my campsite. He had a friendly smile and introduced himself as William. He said he wasn't sure if I saw him set up camp or not, but he saw me across the lake and just wanted to say hi since we were both out in the middle of nowhere at a lake that nobody usually comes to. We talked for a while, and he was really cool actually. William was 26, which was around the same age as me, and we both liked this camping spot because of how secluded it was. After talking for 30 minutes, he went back to the other side of the lake as the sun was coming down. Not much else happened that night, but in the morning, we ended up talking and hanging out for most of the day. He shared a 6-pack of beers with me, and we sat on the beach and had some good casual conversations. When we went back to our tents at the end of the day, I was sitting by my small campfire and was really happy I'd met William. He seemed like the perfect buddy to go camping with, maybe some other time. As it got later though, I started getting ready to stomp out the fire and go to bed when I saw William walking around the lake. His campfire had gone out a while ago, so I thought he was in his tent already sleeping, but apparently not. He walked up to my campfire, and right away, something was different about him. "Hey, everything good, man?" I said. He smiled and was suddenly back to how he was before, but he said he came over to ask if I wanted to see a cool spot he found that had a great view. I said it was kind of late to be going out, but he assured me that the view was great because it was dark out. The way he was hyping it up made me feel like I couldn't not see it. And what would be the point in camping out in the woods if I just passed up the good views? I got up and followed him to the other side of the lake, then trailed behind him as he led us through the woods. There was no path or anything, so I pretty quickly knew that whatever spot this was, William had to have been there many times before to know the exact way without getting lost, especially out in the dark. We walked for maybe 15 minutes before William started slowing down. He pointed ahead and smiled like this was the view, but when I walked in front of him and looked out, there was a small structure. It was an old RV or camper that looked like it had been abandoned and succumbed to the elements for years. Moss grew all over it, and holes of rust covered the siding. I turned back to look at William, wondering what this was, but his face was now cold and empty. He looked like he was a different person. "William, what is this?" He didn't answer. Feeling a rush of fear, I started frantically looking around, and that's when I heard the rusty metal door swing open behind me. I only saw for a quick second as someone else came running out before I started sprinting away. I could hear both William and the other person following close behind, but I gave my every strength to keep going until I lost them. By then, I'd run so far into the woods that I had no idea where I was. I just kept walking and keeping my eyes on the trees until the sun came up. By the time I found my way back to the lake, I saw from the tree line that all of my camping gear was gone. It looked as if I was never even there. I stayed hidden and got back on the trail, making it back to my car. I made a report with the local police, but they never mentioned finding anything. I don't think they even really looked, to be honest. What was planned for me that night is horrifying to think about, but at least I got out before having to witness it firsthand. I had booked an Airbnb several weeks in advance in a town I'd never been to. A client I was meeting for work lived in the area, so I was only staying there for a day and then driving back home afterward. The drive was 3 hours, and when I pulled into the driveway and got out, the neighborhood it was in was very quiet. Most of the house's lights were off, and trees covered the lawns, blocking out most of the view. The only thing I really saw was a person walking down the road. They were far down, and nothing really looked off about it, but for some reason it just gave me a strange feeling. I went up and unlocked the door, going inside and situating myself. It was a very average house, nothing really special about it, but was great for what I needed it for. After making my rounds and checking the place out, I opened the front door to get my other bag from my car. As I stepped onto the porch though, I noticed someone standing in the road. It was the person I'd seen walking a few minutes ago, but they weren't walking anymore. They were just standing in the road and facing the Airbnb. As I started walking toward my car, they noticed me and started walking away. I kept my eye on them while I was out there, getting suspicious about whatever that was. They seemed to just keep walking though, continuing down the street. I went back inside and made sure it was all locked up, then opened the garage and pulled my car in just to be safe. Throughout the next couple hours, I did a few checks outside to see if that guy was still walking around. I didn't see him anymore though, and having to get up early the next morning, I went to bed. I slept decently, waking up a few times during the night, but my alarm went off at 4 a.m. for me to finally get up. The sun was still down, so it was still dark outside, but I groggily sat up in my bed and right away saw a light coming under the bedroom door. I didn't remember leaving any lights on, though I thought I somehow must have just overlooked a kitchen light or something. I got out of bed and walked up to the door, but just before I opened it, I heard something on the other side. It sounded like something moving around at the end of the hallway. I opened the door, seeing it was the living room light that was on, which I immediately knew I definitely would have turned off. The sound continued though, as I walked down the hallway and looked into the living room. A guy was in the corner, searching through one of my bags. He had a black hoodie and ripped up jeans, which was exactly what the person I saw walking around wearing. I only looked at them for a second before they turned around and faced me. He didn't look startled at all. It was almost like he was expecting me. He dropped the bag on the ground and yelled at me to stay where I was. He began making his way over, and I only had a split second to decide what to do. I turned and ran back to the room, slamming the door shut just before he caught up to me. He rammed into it and tried to kick the door down, then started messing with the lock on the other side. I thought quickly and opened a window, jumping out and running away. By the time I was able to get police there, the man wasn't in the house anymore. My bags were gone too, of course, and to make things more terrifying, the bedroom door was opened. He had picked the lock and gotten in, so if I had just stayed and hid in the bathroom or something, who knows what would have happened. Police seemed to think there was more intent behind this man's actions, aside from just robbing me. So I pray he doesn't find me again. This happened in July of last year. My house was having some pretty big problems, and I was left without any power for several days while it was getting repaired. I worked from home, so this was a major issue, and I ultimately had to rent out an Airbnb to stay at for a few days until the power was back on in my home. I don't live in the biggest city, so there weren't too many options for Airbnbs near me. The closest one that was at a reasonable price was about a 45-minute drive from my home. It was in an even smaller and secluded area of the city, which was often referred to as not the best section to live in. I was only staying for a few days though, so the amount I was saving was worth it. When I arrived, I went right inside and basically straight to bed, exhausted from everything going on with my house. In the morning, I got up early and started setting up my laptop and workspace. Just before I had to start work though, there was a knock at the door. I debated whether or not to open it because it wasn't even my house, but thinking it might be the host or something, I went up and checked who it was. On the porch was a man, maybe early 30s, and covered in tattoos. He didn't look like an Airbnb host, or even like a salesperson. Unsure why he was here, and not really wanting to know, I figured I'd leave it. I walked away from the door and back to the desk, finishing getting ready and starting work. I had some meetings and a lot of work to catch up on from my absence the last few days. I don't think I left the desk until 8 p.m., and even then, I was considering going back to work after going out and picking up dinner. Only a couple minutes after I got back and started eating though, another knock came at the door. I immediately got up and went to check who it was, and I wasn't surprised to see it was that same guy from before. What could he possibly want from me this late in the day though? I was actually more bothered than I was concerned. But again, I just walked away from the door and went back to eat my dinner. After 30 minutes, and around 10 p.m., I decided to work for at least another hour. I was tired, but the work had to get done, and I knew putting it off until tomorrow would just make me more stressed. I put my headphones in and tried to focus for the next hour. I got a lot done, and once I was satisfied, I finally closed my laptop for the night. I hadn't realized how dark it had gotten. I guess my laptop screen was the only light I had on. I went to the front and flicked on the light, and a chill instantly rushed through me. Going down the front hallway were faint but unmistakable shoe prints. Looking around, they were all over the place, even going right up behind the desk I was working at. Terrified, I slowly followed them down to the back door, which was cracked open. I don't even know how to describe what I was feeling. It was just pure horror. And only moments after this, footsteps started coming down the stairs. They were slow and careful, but when they got to the bottom, a man peered out into the hallway and looked directly at me. It was that same man, easily distinguishable with all the tattoos and everything, and he looked surprised to see me walking around. But that surprise quickly turned into rage. His face had no emotions other than irritation and anger. I was going to try to say something, but no words came out, and as my heart started pounding in my chest, I turned right back around and sprinted out the back door. I ran through the backyard and into some trees far behind the houses. I sat behind a tree and pulled my phone out, starting to dial 911, but quickly closed it when I heard footsteps running toward me. I didn't expect them to follow me, but luckily they passed by without seeing me and continued to run out into the dark. Once I got in contact with police, I went back to the Airbnb and waited for them. I gave a detailed description of the man, and they actually found him the next day. It was confirmed to be him by the tattoos I had noticed, and he'd actually broken into several homes in the days leading up, doing horrible things to those who lived in them. I don't know what he was planning to do to me, or why he seemed to have left me alone at first, but I can rest easy knowing he won't be able to do anything anymore. I was on a road trip from Portland to Chicago. It's nearly a 3-day drive, so I had some places booked to sleep at along the route. I didn't get too particular with what places I chose, but I went with Airbnbs so I could at least enjoy the road trip a bit more rather than staying in a crowded hotel. My first Airbnb was in Wyoming, and the route through the state doesn't pass through any big cities really, so it was in a really small town. It was probably no bigger than 2 or 3 miles long. As I passed the border into Wyoming, it started snowing heavily, only dragging on the long day of driving. By the time I got into town, the roads were covered in snow and the sun had already set. It was pretty dead though. I mean, I don't know much about small towns, but this seemed exactly how I thought it would be, especially in a low population state like Wyoming. I was hoping there would be a McDonald's or something that I could get a quick dinner from, but it was very clear that there wasn't going to be, so I drove through the town and turned down the road to my Airbnb. It was a long driveway leading up to a small home in the middle of a field with tall, snow-covered pine trees lined up in the front yard. I parked on the side and got out with my bag, then walked around to the front. I put in the code and got inside, closing the door behind me and turning on the lights. It was small, probably 500 square feet, with just a living room and bedroom. I took my shoes off and dropped my bag next to the bed, then sat on the couch. When I did, a thump came from the bedroom. I looked back at the doorway I had just come from. It was pretty loud, but I had no idea what it could have been. I got up and walked back, looking into the room and turning on the light. It was all the same. I went and checked the small bathroom that was in there as well, but it all looked good, and the only other door in the house was the bedroom closet. I walked over and tugged on the door handle, but it didn't budge. It seemed like it was locked from the other side. At first I was pretty weirded out that a bedroom closet would be kept shut, but then I thought it could have been a maintenance closet the owner was storing stuff in. There were no other places to put anything, so that was the final conclusion I came to. I went back to the living room and rested my eyes on the couch while thinking through my plan for the next day. After 15 minutes, I got back up and went over to the window, looking out to see if the snow was still coming down and if the roads were even going to be drivable tomorrow. It was eerily dark outside, with no lights from the town showing behind the tall pine trees, and it was still snowing heavily. I shut the blinds and turned back to the couch, but I saw a shadow move in the bedroom. It was slow and smooth, like the shadow to a door opening or closing. I started walking over, listening as I approached the doorway and looked inside the room. Everything was in place and nothing looked to have caused the shadow I saw, but I knew I saw something move in there. I continued looking around until my eyes fell back on the closet. It was still closed, but something gave me an unsettling feeling about it. I stepped up and grabbed the handle, and it opened with ease. It wasn't locked anymore. But inside, there wasn't anything. It was just a small and empty walk-in closet. Before I could fully process everything and try to put the pieces together, I heard someone behind me. When I turned around, a large man was standing in the doorway to the bathroom. He looked beaten and tired, having scratches and cuts all over his face. And as I stared at him, he didn't even seem to care. He stepped into the bedroom and kneeled down, grabbing a dirty and worn duffel bag from under the bed. The man then stood back up and didn't even look at me as he slowly walked out of the room and out the front door. I ran up and saw him trailing through the snow until he was beyond the lights from the house. I tried to get police involved, but after giving my description, they really only talked to the Airbnb host. After leaving town, I didn't get any more information. I think it's most likely that he was just using the place to sleep or something, but the way he looked makes me second guess that. I just can't even think of what could have happened if I went right to bed that night, with the man hiding in the closet just inches away from me. I was backpacking through a route I'd found in the Cascades National Park. It was an out-and-back trail that typically takes 3 days one way and 3 days back. I didn't know too much about it, or how popular of a trail it was, but when doing these long backpacking routes, it usually doesn't matter, because you'll most likely not run into many people anyway. On my 3rd day out though, I passed by one of the campsites and saw a man sitting by his tent. I took a break and we talked for a bit, where he mentioned he was staying there for the night and heading to the peak of the trail on the following day. I told him that that's where I was heading today, and that I'll probably see him when he gets there. I left shortly after and got to what would be my campsite for the next 2 nights. The view was something I'd never experienced before and made for a great rest day and peak of the trail. For that whole day, nobody passed through, and when it came to night, I was still the only one camping there. I thought back to that guy I'd met at the campsite a day behind me, who said he'd be reaching this trail peak on this day. He never showed up though. I thought he maybe decided to turn around for some reason, or just camp out for another day at the place he was already at. In the morning, I packed up and started back down the way I came, though I got a late start, so at the very least, I was hoping to make it to that same campsite the man was at. I was really sore for some reason too, which didn't help, and before I knew it, there was almost no daylight left. I put on my headlamp and continued on the trail, walking for another hour past sundown before I made it to the camp. The tent that the man had was still there, set up like he never left. Knowing his plans to continue hiking, and just knowing that staying at one camp for several days while backpacking is unusual, I called out, asking if he was okay. There was no response. I walked up a bit closer and said I just wanted to check in on him, but the flap on his tent was partially open and nobody was inside. I felt a lump in my throat, like my body knew something wasn't right. I stood and looked all around, not seeing a single sign of him anywhere, until I saw a glimmer in the distance. There was a faint light sitting still far out in the woods. I began walking up to it, going about 40 yards from the tents before I found the source. It was a headlamp laying on the ground like it had been accidentally left behind, and the light was so dim that it must have been nearly out of batteries. And it was just then that I noticed someone watching me. They were standing not too far, just 10 yards away, and clearly trying to not be seen. I knew in my gut that this wasn't the man from before, but I felt like I had to say or do something.
Hello? Do you need help?
They stood still and quiet.
I'm sorry. I'll leave.
I said shakily, then hurried back to the tent. Luckily, I hadn't unpacked anything yet, so I put my backpack on and started walking out of the campsite. As I did, the headlamp in the woods turned off. I got away and walked as far as I could, going another 3 miles to the next camp. I reported it as soon as I could as well, and unfortunately, it was just what I thought it was. The man that I had met was missing. There's almost no traces for them to follow, and out in the backcountry, it's nearly impossible to search for anyone. Who that person I saw out there was is likely the biggest unknown that could give us answers as to what happened, though it seems like most of us are aware of the most probable scenario that took place. There's a forest with a bunch of trails and camping spots. A couple years ago, I went back to visit my family for a week and decided to go camping while I was there. The gear I had was very basic, but I wasn't trying to do anything crazy. I just wanted to find a good spot and camp for a night or two. I started on a somewhat random trail and followed it for a while. I knew most of the trails led to a pond that was a few miles into the forest, so I was expecting to end up there. But as I got to mile 5 or 6, I realized it was going to somewhere else. I was actually excited to see where it led to, but after hours of walking, it almost seemed like it was an endless trail leading to nowhere. Eventually, my legs were starting to give out, so I found a small spot on the side of the trail to stake out for the night. It was just about dusk, so I was racing against the sun to get everything set up and to get a campfire going. I only had a few minutes to spare before the whole forest was dark. The campfire lit up a decent distance around, but not enough for me to go out any more than 15 to 20 feet from the camp. I stayed sitting and boiled some water, making tea to calm down for the night. It was hard to tell the time, but an hour probably passed, and it was well into the night already when I heard someone coming down the trail. I didn't think it was a person at first, like maybe a bear or something, but as they got closer, I could tell that it was definitely a person. I listened as they walked down the trail, and their figure became slightly visible in the light. I was just barely too far from the trail to be able to make out anything about them, though. All I could see is that it was a tall person with a backpack. They didn't stop or anything. They just walked along the trail and past my campsite. As the sound of their footsteps faded out, I thought it was pretty strange that they weren't carrying a flashlight and were hiking well into the night. From the small amount I could make out, though, having seen a large backpack, I assumed they knew what they were doing, and that's pretty much the last I thought about it. I stayed up by my campfire for another hour, then waited for it to burn out before getting in my tent and trying to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, though, having to pee. I tried to hold it in and go back to sleep, but I just couldn't get comfortable after having already woken up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out, walking a good 20 or so feet from my campsite. I did my business, then turned around to go back, but far out on the other side of my tent, I saw something move. The moonlight wasn't nearly enough for me to have gotten a clear sight of it, but something in me knew that it was a person. I slowly walked back to the tent with my eyes wide open, looking all around at the trees surrounding my camp. I then carefully reached in and grabbed my backpack, taking out a flashlight. I turned it on, and it immediately revealed a person standing by the trail. They were tall, looking just like the person I'd seen at the start of the night. Just as quick as I saw them, though, they ran off behind the trees and out of the light, and it was suddenly silent again. I probably sat there for a whole minute with the flashlight before realizing there was nothing I could do other than leave as soon as possible. I packed what I could, only leaving my cheap tent, then started walking toward the trail. Once I got to where I'd last seen them, I only got even more terrified because there were no signs of them anywhere. I didn't know if they were still watching me or even following me. I kept my flashlight on and walked on the trail, shining it all around at the trees as I cautiously made my way back. The sun started coming up halfway through, and I was able to make it back unharmed. When I got home, I looked up the exact trail I took, and from what I saw, it wasn't even an established trail. So maybe it was someone like me, just going on whatever path they saw. But that doesn't explain what happened. Why were they stalking my camp in the middle of the night? And how long were they there? I think that night was more likely than not supposed to be my last, and the outcome of me leaving when I did was probably the only outcome where I'd get to leave. I was driving across the country for a kind of hectic trip. I had to get some things done for work at an office way up in Maine, and decided that while I was there already on the road trip, that I'd visit some of my friends and family on the East Coast. During my 4th day of driving, I was spending most of that day going through Pennsylvania. There were a lot of cool towns, but most of the drive was through nothing. And to get where I was going, it was taking me on a lot of side routes, which were these long and empty one-lane highways. As it was getting late, rain started coming down, and my fuel was running low. I hadn't passed any gas stations in a while, so I figured there had to be one soon. But again, this road wasn't really going through any towns. I continued through the rain for another 30 minutes, and barely through the fog, I saw a sign for a gas station, and a couple moments later, it showed up ahead of me. It was off the side of the road, nestled in the trees, and was really small. It only had 2 pumps and a tiny concession building behind it. Having no other choice, I pulled in and parked, getting out and opening up my gas tank. When I pulled the pump off and tried to insert my card though, it didn't work. I wiped the dusty screen and tried to see what it was saying, but it didn't say anything. It wasn't even on. I then went over to the only other pump, and it was also off. Frustrated, I looked around. With it raining and being well past sunset, it was really hard to make anything out. Sure, the place looked old and outdated, but so did a lot of other gas stations. After a closer look though, I noticed a small light inside the concession building. Hoping it was a worker that could help me, I stepped out from under the overhang covering the pumps and ran up to the door. Moisture was covering the entire glass door, so I couldn't see inside. All I could see was the light reflecting through the glass. I grabbed the handle and it screeched open. When I stepped inside, I immediately knew something was wrong. The store shelves were empty and some even knocked over, and the place just looked like it was destroyed. The light was coming from somewhere in the back though, and was now clearly some sort of lamp or something. Definitely not a regular store light. I was only in there for a few seconds, and after seeing all of that, I quickly stepped back outside. I didn't know what was going on in there, but I knew it couldn't be anything good, and definitely not helpful for my situation. As I backed out of the store and into the rain, I turned around toward my car, but a person was standing next to it. They were completely drenched in water and were just looking around my car and into the windows. "Hey, what are you doing?" I yelled as I quickly made my way up to them. They shot a look at me, then moved their eyes behind me. I turned back to look at the building. The front door was opened and a man came out into the rain. He had long black hair and a sickly look. He spent no time assessing the situation and instantly started running at me. The other person by my car just backed away as I got inside, but the man running didn't slow down. He came right up to my door and tried opening it, and as I pulled away, a loud metallic scrape vibrated through the car. I sped out of there and back onto the road, making it another half hour before my car ran out of gas. Luckily, I had cell service in the area and was able to get help. While I waited though, I looked at the outside of my car and saw a huge line going across the door. It looked like the man had run a knife along it when I drove away. Police informed me later that night that the gas station I was at was not in service for at least a decade. Other than that though, nothing else came of it. And what would have happened if I didn't get out in time is left to nothing but theories. I live in the Midwest, and there happens to be a lot of abandoned places near me. I was in my last year of high school at the time, and my friends and I would often go to these creepy places for fun. It was a pretty normal thing that kids around here did. This was on Memorial Day weekend, which meant we had 3 days off of school, and with the year coming to a close, we decided to go explore a place that we'd been wanting to go to for a while. It was a ghost town called Cairo, which isn't technically a full ghost town because a small portion is still lived in. From what I know, it was built up in the late 1800s, and due to flooding and racial conflicts, it slowly lost its population. For almost 50 years, most of the town has been completely empty and untouched, left to just decay. Hearing about this, and hearing stories from other people who had been there, we were all really invested in seeing it for ourselves. On Sunday, around 6, my friend Tristan picked me and Ryan up, then we drove 2 hours south to Cairo. Most of the drive was through huge farmlands and fields with not many towns or cities nearby. When we got onto the road going through Cairo, it was probably the most eerie feeling I'd ever gotten. There were faint lights far down the road, coming from what looked like a few residents' houses, but everything between that was pitch black and completely abandoned. We parked on the side next to some old brick building that said liquor on it, then got out of the car. We all stood there for a minute, not really saying anything, and just listening. The wind was blowing around, making the metal and wood creak all throughout the buildings, but other than that, it was absolutely silent. Ryan led the way, walking down the road as we looked around. On the left side of the road were small wooden homes swallowed by vines and bushes, and on the right side was a line of old shops. As we got toward the middle, one of them stood out to us. There was a sign sticking out from the brick that said Gem. It looked like it was an old theater, even having a ticket booth next to the entrance. We all agreed to check it out, so we pulled out our flashlights and entered through one of the windows. It was obviously really dark inside, and our flashlights were pretty terrible to be honest, lighting up only a couple feet in the direction we pointed them in. The main room was really dusty and had an awful odor to it, like rotting wood or mold. The floor was covered in debris as well, but as we looked around, Ryan suddenly told us to stop. Tristan and I immediately stopped moving and talking and just stared at Ryan. He looked like he had heard something, so we all stood in silence and listened for any noises. After a minute, Ryan broke the silence and said he swore he heard something above us. He said it was like a single footstep, but Tristan and I didn't hear it and thought it was probably just the building creaking. We looked around some more before going through the only other doorway, which led up some stairs to a second floor. This floor was actually where all the seats were at. There were about 50 chairs leading up to a balcony where the stage was on the floor below. We started walking in, going down the row of steps through the chairs, when a small creak from behind us made us all turn around. In the corner, a man was standing between the wall and one of the chairs. He looked completely disheveled and homeless, and he was staring right at us while holding up one of his arms. In his hand was a small revolver, and he was pointing it directly at me. It was still silent in the building, to the point where I could literally hear my heart beating through my body, before Tristan ran back down the stairs, leaving just me and Ryan. We tried to stay calm and told him we were just going to leave, but the man didn't speak or move. So we carefully started walking back to the stairs, and as soon as we were out of sight, we booked it out of the theater and back to the car. We drove away and spent the better part of an hour driving in silence as we all soaked in what happened. My guess is that the man we saw used to live in the community, but as it fell apart, he probably got caught up in the mess and was forced to hide and live in one of the abandoned buildings. There were a lot of ways that situation could have ended, and all of us getting out unharmed was unlikely, and we haven't tested our luck at any other places since then. This was about 10 months ago now. I was spending a few days with my best friend from college in his hometown. I'll call him Chris for privacy. It was a really small town from what I was used to, but Chris was showing me around and we went to the bars and just hung out and had a good time. On my last night there, he mentioned a place he'd been wanting to explore for a while, but hadn't had anyone to go with. It was some abandoned house or town he knew of a few miles out in the woods. We used to go exploring and backpacking all the time in college, so it sounded like a pretty cool idea. Only 30 minutes after hearing about it, we were already trekking through a path in the woods. We still had some sunlight left, but we brought headlamps just in case. About 20 minutes of walking, the trail ended and we had to follow a very faint footpath through the trees. It went on for another hour before we made it. We could see a house out in the distance, and as we got closer, we could see several more behind it. It wasn't what either of us expected, though. The houses didn't really look that old. They looked weathered and heavily damaged, but had modern siding and stuff like that made them look kind of like any other house. There was even a tiny gravel road leading from each of the homes. It looked like maybe they were trying to build a community and something went wrong, causing them to abandon it. Other people had been there before us, though, evident by the graffiti on the sides of the houses. Chris and I went up to the first house, looking through the open doorway. There were weeds growing through the floorboards, but it was otherwise empty. Before we stepped in, though, a loud slamming sound echoed through the woods. Both of us jumped and stared down the gravel road that we thought it came from. After that sound, though, it was quiet. We had no idea what it was, but after seeing nothing, we went inside the house. There wasn't too much to look at, but what made it so interesting was trying to figure out why anyone would abandon it. The house looked like it would have been nice before it was left behind. After walking around the first floor, we went upstairs to the second. Oddly, it got way darker upstairs, like no windows were letting in any light. The hallway was short, with only 2 doors and what looked like an attic in the ceiling. We went up to the first door and opened it, seeing another empty room. But we were quickly interrupted by hearing something downstairs. There were shuffling footsteps coming through the grass and up to the house we were in. We stayed quiet, but we were sure that whoever they were had probably seen us outside. But why would they try to approach us? They walked up to the front doorway, then stopped just before they entered. "Hello?" We didn't respond. "I just want to talk. No harm at all." He sounded older and almost like he was missing teeth or something, stumbling a bit over his words. After that, though, there was a whole minute of silence. He didn't say anything else, but we didn't hear him leave either. We waited another few minutes, still not hearing anything, before Chris quietly went down the staircase and looked over at the front door. He turned and looked back at me with a pale face. "There's nobody there." I quickly went to see for myself, but he wasn't lying. He was nowhere in the doorway. We carefully made our way down and over to the doorway. Looking out, there was one line of footprints in the grass coming from where the other houses were, but no footprints leaving. Both of us figured it out at the same time and bolted for the trees, knowing the guy must have been hiding inside the house somehow. We got out of the woods as fast as we could and went back to his place. Who that guy was and why he wanted to talk to us, we don't know. I'm sure if he'd found us, though, we probably wouldn't be here.
Before I moved to Indiana with my girlfriend, I lived with my dad on a ranch in the middle of nowhere in a small town called Hartville in Wyoming. Seriously, the town had maybe 50 people in it total. It was really that small. A measly 25% of the population alone was probably my own family. I have 3 brothers, 1 sister, and, well, of course, my dad. My mom passed away from heart disease when I was young, and it really sucked. It really sucks not having her around, as she truly made everything in my life so much better, in all of our lives. I had some aunts and uncles, and 1 cousin as well that lived near us. I was going to miss them all, but it was time for me to live my own life. After all, I was 20 years old, and I had dreams of the city life, and I always wanted to be a veterinarian. My girlfriend at the time, now wife, and I are very close, and we have been since we met. What started out as a long-distance relationship quickly turned into an 8-year marriage so far and still going strong. The first few weeks in Indiana was amazing. Apart from missing my family back home, it really felt like everything was coming together, and I was unbelievably happy to say the least. My wife recently just moved into her own house, and I moved in with her. She also kind of lived in the country, but barely. It was nowhere near as desolated as my old house was in Wyoming. We were only 5 minutes from the nearest city in Indiana, if that. In Wyoming, my family and I were literally at least 30 minutes away from any store at all. Now, with all the good things that were going on in my life, there was a bit of a problem. You see, the house in Indiana had a long history of sketchy and weirdly horrific horrors and rumors about it. Some of them were true and not just rumors, but some of them were just flat out fake as hell, and I knew they weren't true. However, before Leslie, my wife, moved into the house, it had been broken into at least 3 or 4 times, all in the time span of 20 years. We only knew about this because of our neighbors, and we definitely believed them. We had no reason not to. Plus, besides that, Leslie told me about how she would see this guy in the property before I moved in, at least 3 different times that she was sure of. She had no idea who the guy was, though. He only came around during the day. Every time he showed up, apparently, he would stare from the end of the road and then slowly make his way up to the house and up to the window in the kitchen or the dining room and glare inside the house. Every time this happened, Leslie called the police, but they never caught him. He would always be gone by the time the cops made it there. Most of the people who live in rural areas are nice and really sweet old people, or just middle-aged parents with a family. But every once in a while, you'll run into a real whack job. The country is a good place to lay low, and unfortunately, there definitely is a place for everybody. A lot of lowlifes, aka sex offenders or druggies, will live out there to try and stay low-key and under the radar from the police, or just people in general. I, of course, was very concerned about this guy, and Leslie was deeply terrified of him, understandably. I obviously wasn't scared, but definitely worried. You never know what someone is capable of. Anyways, we would be okay because I had a pump-action shotgun along with a .45 handgun and a revolver. And even at that, I had my fair share collection of knives and daggers. I reassured Leslie that everything was going to be okay. Well, one night around 10:30, give or take, we were hanging out in the living room watching a movie and we were both half asleep. Shockingly, we both wake up to a knock on our front door. It was extremely loud and completely out of the blue, so it jump-scared the living heck out of us. I jumped up and ran to our room and I grabbed my shotgun out of the closet before anything, and I was about ready to lose my cool. I looked out of the blinds first to make sure it was someone we didn't know. We both got a good look at the man, and Leslie confirmed it was the same stranger who had been showing up to the house unannounced time and time again. He hadn't seen either of us yet at this point. I opened the door and I prepared for the worst. But just like that, he was gone. I stepped outside and I swore I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I told Leslie to go back inside and grab the .45 and to sit in our room on the bed and wait for me. I looked all around for the man and I was yelling at him and telling him to show himself. That's when it hit me. I looked over to my left and I saw that our shed that we don't even use, the side door was wide open. I ran over to the shed and I started hearing noises inside. Almost like somebody was moving stuff around. The light was off and I couldn't see a thing. I didn't say anything because I didn't want him to know I was right there. I was going to wait for him to come out, but something got a hold of me inside and I couldn't hold back. I was so pissed off that he was scaring Leslie and him disturbing our night. I was genuinely infuriated. I wasn't going to let him get away with this, even if my life depended on it. I slowly but surely made my way to the door and I was almost inside now. I took one more step and now I was directly in the door frame with my other leg behind me still touching the grass outside. I looked inside and the noise stopped. He must have heard me or noticed me somehow. I went to turn on the light, but of course the light bulb was out because it wasn't turning on. That's when things went from horrible to much, much worse. Out of nowhere, I heard the man start running towards me and I stepped back and I couldn't believe it, but I accidentally pulled the trigger. I stood still in disbelief as I couldn't believe what I just did. I didn't hit him, but I'm saying it didn't even seem to scare him. He continued running at me and I hadn't pumped the shotgun yet after shooting it. At this point, I was probably 10 feet away from the shed, and there he was. We were staring right at each other. I pointed the gun at him, and I told him to leave or I was going to kill him. "Do it then. You won't kill me. You're a coward." Then he proceeded to call me every name in the book. Then that's when the police sirens came about in the mere distance, and he knew he was done for. I looked at him with a deceiving smile, and I dropped my shotgun as he tried to run away. I tackled him to the ground, and I put him in a full Nelson, and I held him there until the cops arrived on scene, and I let them do their thing. I'm glad Leslie called the police. I was hoping that's what she was doing because I didn't tell her to. Everything happened so fast, and I was worried she wasn't going to call them, considering the last 3 times they showed up 30 minutes late each time. Anyways, we're worried that he's going to come back. We have a restraining order on him, but obviously, there's really nothing stopping him from coming back if he really wanted to. When he gets out of jail, that is. Or maybe he already is out of jail, I don't know. All I know is that if he does come back, his ass is mine, and next time I won't be so nice. Family comes first, and I won't let anything get in the way of that. Leslie and I are trying to move, but it's a lot easier said than done. She spent just about all of her savings on the down payment of this place, so we're going to have to hang tight for a while.
This is a story of my best friend and what her life is like with the stalker. This will be the abridged version, but still will be long. She knew of him through a mutual friend, and he lived in Delaware. We lived in Tennessee. He came to visit his friend, met her once, then decided to move here. After he had lived here for 6 months, they began dating. 3 months into them dating, he admitted he moved here because he wanted to be closer to her, even though they weren't romantically involved at the time. Before they had ever dated, he asked her what she wanted for her birthday. She said that she likes stars, so just something with stars on it. And he literally bought her a star in the sky and named it Tara. It was also accompanied with a very intense and creepy love letter. She didn't see it as a warning sign, and she liked the attention. I told her that it was overboard and creepy. The first week of them dating, he began going through her phone and purse at every opportunity. She was furious about this and told him her phone is private. She said he should only snoop if he has a good reason to do so, not just because he wants to keep tabs on who she texts. She puts a lock on her phone, but it doesn't take long for him to figure out the lock code. He didn't admit to going through her phone again, but she knew he was, because he would always seem to bring up a person that may have texted her that day, or the subject that was spoken of. Some phone numbers of her closest guy friends had been changed in her phone as well. He wouldn't let her go anywhere without him. He would make plans with her for every single day of the week, and then make her promise to follow through with the plans, even though they lived together. If she ever went back on the plans because something else came up that she wanted to do, he would throw a bit of a fit and say she's a liar because she didn't keep her promise. It was things like she had promised to eat dinner at home with him, small things. He would often react violently. She became increasingly agitated with this controlling and smothering behavior and told him that she wanted to go have girl time with me, that she needs some breathing space for a night. He made her promise to let him come if we hung out with other people. About an hour before she was coming to meet me, I got a phone call from a friend that had moved across the country. He was in town and wanted to see me. I told him that I would have a friend with me that night, but we'd swing by his house for about an hour if she was okay with it. I asked Tara if she's cool with it, and she says of course. A few minutes later, I got a text from him asking if he could come because of the promise that Tara had made to him. I said, I'm sorry, but I don't think it's acceptable. This is a friend that I haven't seen in several years, and I'm already taking one person over to his mom's house that he doesn't know. It would be rude to bring another. And we're only staying there for about an hour anyways. A few minutes after, Tara texts and says she's walking out her door. She never makes it to my house. I called and texted but couldn't get to her. I finally got one text from her that just said, "Help." I immediately drove to her apartment where I found her on her balcony. He had stolen her phone and locked her on her balcony so she couldn't leave. They broke up for a while, and I guess out of being lonely, she got back with him. One night, he bursted through my front door unannounced because he hadn't talked to Tara in 30 minutes. She went to dinner with a family friend, and he was following her and spying on her. Her phone had died, and he panicked when he lost track of her. He freaked out in my living room, and I also found out that he had saved the numbers of all the guys she had in her phone. I told him he was not allowed to be near me again, even if Tara was with him. He seemed to act normal for a while until Tara became pregnant. He was ecstatic, and she was scared. After about a week, she started getting excited about being a parent. That was until she started adding some things up. Her birth control had mysteriously vanished not long before she got pregnant. He was giving her vitamins every day and watching her take them. He said she needed to take them because she's anemic. When she looked up the pills, they were for fertility. She also remembered a few times when he said he was wearing a condom, and she didn't think it felt like one was there. He had been trying to get her pregnant. She understandably chose to not keep the baby after finding this out, and she was terrified of him after this. He would have used that baby as a way to get to Tara. It would have meant nothing more to him. They split again. He still lived in their apartment after they split, and she would drop by here and there to get some of her stuff. He seemed to be handling things okay until Thanksgiving. He threw her all over the apartment when she stopped by for stuff. That night, he said he was going to spend the night out of town in Nashville, that he needed Tara to stay there and watch his puppy. She made sure it had food and water, but didn't want to be there in case he came back. He did. At 1 a.m., she gets dozens of phone calls from him. He was never in Nashville. He was just trying to get her alone and flipped his shit when she wasn't there. He sent her 115 texts that all said, "Respond to me." He began driving by her work and house all the time. He would call and text her incessantly. He told her that he isn't promising his sanity or her safety, and that he would kill her. He started taking her mail even. I told her that I would go get her mail for her, but he said he wouldn't give it to me. He'd only give it to her if she came in person. He began threatening me and saying that it was my fault. Yes, I had encouraged her to get away from him. He was insane and everyone was scared for her. She was living at my house because he didn't know where I lived at the time. I finally decided to treat him like a kid, and I called his mother in Delaware. I told her of his behavior and threats and asked if she could help him. He ended up moving back to Delaware, but would still call and text Tara all the time. He also made sure to bash her to every person she knew. He would come back to town often, and he would go everywhere he knew she would go. He would go places where her friends worked. He would drive by her work. He would send her gifts, and sometimes she'd see him waiting outside of places she was at. It finally stopped, though. She had a year of silence from him, and she had even moved to a different state with the guy she was dating. Her and her new boyfriend split, and she moved back home to Tennessee and started working at a hotel. He once came into her hotel and bought a room for the night. The next morning, he checked out and drove back to Delaware. He drove 12 hours to stay at her hotel for one night, and then turned around and went back. He sent her a text a few months ago saying he's moving back here. For several years, she was constantly on edge. She gets nervous if she sees a car like his, and she has a genuine fear that he will hurt her if he gets the opportunity. She thinks he'll kill her one day, and I'm also afraid of that as well. She has numerous police reports over this guy, and I hate seeing how he's damaged her, and she's afraid to get close to another guy. She doesn't want kids now, and she's always nervous. We still use the buddy system. She doesn't go anywhere at all by herself. It only takes one moment of her being alone for him to get her. My high school is near an area with a lot of gang violence, so lockdowns were a rather common occurrence. However, the one event that sticks out in my mind when I think back didn't actually have anything to do with that. The only time I actually felt scared wasn't because of a fugitive or a shooting. It was because of a student who everyone already knew was dangerous. His name was Jason. He was one of those kids that was crazy smart, but had a lot of problems with authority, focusing, socializing, and so on. I'm sure everyone knows at least one kid like that from school. He got suspended for bringing a knife to school once, and then expelled the same year for trying to strangle a teacher with a shoelace. He came back the next year, though, after going to an intervention school for several months. Unfortunately, it seems like he came back worse than when he left. I got the pleasure of being stuck in the front office with him once, when we both got in trouble for different things at around the same time, and ended up sitting in there together. The assistant principal was supposed to give both of us an individual talking to, but it must have been a crazy day because we had to wait for her to get through talking to someone else first. In the span of a few minutes, Jason talked my ear off about the kids he met in the intervention school, like pyromaniacs and drug dealers, and even gang members. They were definitely a bad influence on him, but honestly, I think he should have stayed there. He seemed like he belonged. He talked very highly of his experience, and he said he made friends there, which surprised me. I was actually kind of entertained by the stories of what he got up to with those kids. But then he dropped a piece of information that I knew was bad news. Jason told me that someone at the intervention school had helped him learn how to make a bomb. Right before I could ask him if he was serious, the assistant principal came out of her office and called Jason in. That was the last time, and really the only time that I ever talked to him. It was really weird, because despite all of the stuff I heard about him, he was actually in a great mood and seemed very happy, even though he was in trouble again. I thought it was possible that he might get better, but I realize now the only thing that made him happy was remembering the violent criminals he hung out with and thinking about ways to hurt people. By the third week of school, I'm sure he was dying to get back to that other school. That's the only reason I can think of for what he did, because otherwise it feels completely unprovoked, unless he really just got a pleasure from doing it. During second period one day, soon after the day I talked to him, he called in a bomb threat. He was apprehended quickly, but he refused to give up the location of the bomb, so the whole school was evacuated. I vividly remember the feeling of my stomach doing a flip when I saw Jason's clear backpack sitting against the wall of the hallway we were walking through. The inside was stuffed with a garbage bag, so I knew it had to be the bomb. I told one of the administrators, who radioed it in. I felt lucky then that it didn't go off when all those kids were filing out the building, packed in like sardines. I was shaking as I was walking out to the football field, but I was able to get a seat at the bleachers instead of having to stand. We were out there in lockdown mode for hours, baking in the hot sun and just waiting to go back inside. But the bomb squad had to be called in to take care of the bag, and the whole school had to be swept for other bombs afterwards. I went from being scared, to annoyed, to bored, and then finally I was restless. I started horsing around with the people sitting next to me, pretending I was getting a heat stroke and needed to lay down. Nobody was buying any of my BS or making any room for me, so as a joke, I laid down across their feet. It was all pretty funny, and they were kicking me and laughing, but while I was down there, I saw something that petrified me. Something was taped to the bottom of the seat right in front of my face. I pushed a kid's legs apart to get a better look, and of course, he thought I was being weird until he saw the look on my face. He was sitting right on top of a bomb. It was a box wrapped in duct tape with a note that said, "This is the real one, I swear." I flipped out and jumped from the bleachers, twisting my ankle and causing a massive panic as everyone caught wind of the danger and fled all at once. With nowhere safe to run and 1,000 kids running out of control, the whole situation was almost disastrous. A couple freshmen got trampled and ended up with broken bones. Kids hopped the fences and ran out into the road, swarmed into nearby shops, and a lot of kids took the opportunity to just run all the way home. By the time the panic stopped, the school was basically deserted. I'm sure if Jason ever found out, he would die of laughter. What really makes it embarrassing, though, is the fact that it was all fake. None of the bombs were real. The thing is, Jason was totally smart enough to make real bombs and actually kill people. And the only reason he didn't was because his goal wasn't to go to prison for a bunch of years, but to go to juvie or another intervention school. All that fear and panic and wasted time was just part of a sick joke Jason was playing. What makes me shudder is knowing that if he had decided to go through with it, a lot of people would have died, and I would have very likely been one of them. Nobody was prepared for the threat. He pointed out a gigantic weakness in the school's response. His placements would have been extremely deadly if they weren't just fake bombs. I don't know where Jason is now, but I hope he stays far away from me for the rest of my life. There used to be this kid at my school named Blake. Blake faced a lot of bullying from pretty much everybody, both behind his back and directly to his face. It's not like he didn't deserve it though. He was prone to violence and often got in trouble for screaming in teachers' faces, because he was clearly indoctrinated into some crazy ideas that went against what they teach in school. I guess that means it's not totally his fault for how his parents raised him, but that never stopped anybody. Blake was just as physically repulsive as he was in conversation. He almost got kicked out of school for harassing a girl pretty badly after she rejected him for smelling like hot garbage. If only that had gone through, then things would have ended differently. It started one day when I was in history class with Blake. He stopped the class to dispute something the teacher said about the Civil War, and it ended up becoming a huge thing. The teacher was pretty cold with shutting Blake down with the facts, humiliating him pretty badly. This led to Blake screaming a bunch of stuff about how the country had been ruined. Then we all collectively laughed him off, and he stormed out of the school. That was a Friday. Over the course of the weekend, Blake posted a bunch of stuff on his Snapchat. Pictures of him holding pieces from his dad's gun collection, which he was known for bragging about extensively, and pictures of him posing in front of a Nazi flag, which was also his dad's, I assume. But the worst part of all was a photo of our history teacher printed out and taped to a cardboard box, which he used for target practice, with the caption, "Getting ready for school on Monday." The posts were pretty chilling. For years, people had joked that Blake would do something like that one day, but nobody ever thought he actually had the guts. Several people reported the post to the school, but what they should have done was reported to the police. Nobody, including myself, took it seriously enough. If I had, there was no chance I would have gone to school until he was taken care of. At school the following Monday, from what I heard afterwards, Blake came to school late, during 5th period when we had our American history class. He wasn't able to get into class like normally. He was confronted by the school resource officer and a couple of admins who demanded to search his backpack. That's when he drew the pistol and shot the resource officer and ran off. I heard the shot from the other side of the school. Everything went silent. Moments later, the lockdown order went out. We all knew it was Blake. I looked at my teacher, who was white as a sheet. All I could see were the bullet holes in the picture of his face from Blake's post in my head. After a few seconds, he regained his composure and went through the procedure of locking the door and turning out the lights, then ordering all of us to hide out of sight. Not a moment too soon either. We all knew Blake was heading for him, and all of us by proximity. I barely had time to think to myself about how those dumb lockdown drills weren't so dumb anymore. Blake made it to the classroom door in under a minute. He started banging on the door and screaming, "I know you're in there, I'm not an idiot." People started crying into their shirts to keep quiet. Others took out their phones and started live streaming or texting their loved ones, assuming they wouldn't survive. Even I started to think that way. I couldn't think of anything to do. I didn't even have the presence of mind to think of what I might do to fight or protect myself if he were to get inside. My mind was too frayed, and it all felt so unreal. The only thing running through my head was the fact that I was about to die while sitting on the tile floor of my high school, cowering in the darkness in a huddle of students that was about to become a pile of bodies. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The crying became screaming and everyone started to panic. In the moment, I made a split-second decision and ran over to the window, opting to jump from the second story, instead of just sitting there and waiting for Blake to come in and shoot me. A bunch of kids followed me, but then I fumbled around. Somebody else shoved me out of the way because I was taking too long and sent me to the floor. That's when I looked back through the door and noticed something. Blake was holding his face with both of his hands and the blood was seeping out between his fingers. The door handle on the inside was lopsided, like he had been trying to break in. I sat there, staring, just trying to make sense of it. In the chaos, the teacher was yelling at us to get away from the windows and get back to hiding. He started calling my name because I wasn't moving, and that's when I blankly said the words, "I think Blake shot himself." I said it pretty quietly for how loud the classroom was, and I said it like a husk. But enough people heard me to stop what they were doing and go silent. A friend of mine ran to the door and looked out the window right as Blake was running away. I finally got up and stood there next to him. Blood was splattered across the floor, and in the newfound quietness, I could hear Blake's cries of pain echoing through the hallway. Stupidly, and against every bit of sense I had, I tried to open the door, but it was broken. Not just locked, as all doors are supposed to open from the inside. It was broken. We were trapped inside the classroom, but at least Blake was gone. Hours later, we were finally freed and slowly learned what had happened. Blake tried to open the door by shooting the door handle, but he ended up mangling the lock completely shut and causing an explosion of metal shrapnel, which flew up right into his face. A piece of twisted metal got lodged in his eye, blinding him, and that was the end of his rampage. A lucky break for all of us, and it goes to disprove the myth that you can open a lock just by shooting it. Blake surrendered before leaving the school and was tried as an adult. He'll be in prison for the next 20 years at least. The resource officer he shot also got lucky and recovered without serious lasting effects to his health. I came over from Serbia at age 13 with my mother. My older brother, who was 15 years older than me, had lived in America for a few years, and he sent for us. My mom wouldn't be staying, although at the time I wasn't aware of that. Anyway, we landed in New York City, and the plan was my brother would come get us. However, my niece decided to come early, and my brother's wife went into labor shortly before we landed. My brother couldn't leave his wife, so he asked a coworker of his. They drove cabs to pick us up in New York City and drive us to New Jersey, where he and my sister-in-law lived. When we got to New York City, we waited in customs for what seemed like forever. We looked for my brother's friend but didn't see him. This was the early 90s and cell phones weren't as commonplace, and even if they were, my mom and I didn't have one. Suddenly, we heard our names being called and I saw a tall man. He introduced himself in perfect Serbian and explained he was a good friend of my brother's and told us about the baby. He said he'd be driving us the 2 hours from the airport to my brother's home. My mom relaxed and they happily began to converse about the baby and my brother in America. I, however, just felt off. This guy gave me bad vibes, and regardless of my brother's friendship with him, I felt distrustful of him. We drove for a good hour and a half when he announced he was going to take us to breakfast. We hadn't eaten in over 15 hours, so we were starving by then. We pulled up to a house and my mom and I were confused. He insisted cheerfully that his wife was cooking us breakfast, and after that, we drive the rest of the way to the hospital to see my family. My mom shushed me when I whispered something didn't feel right and told me that we needed to be grateful for the hospitality. We were led up into the house. It was dark and dank and dirty. Suddenly, I think my mom finally got a bit nervous and started insisting he take us to my brother. Suddenly, the guy grabbed my mom by the wrist and he told her that he needed a wife to take care of him in his house. And when he heard my brother tell the others at work she'd be coming to stay, he knew he'd found a wife. I at the time was a scrawny little scamp of a kid, and I tried pushing him off of my mom, but he hit me so hard that I saw stars. At this point, we were obviously terrified. Neither of us spoke English, and we only knew my brother's home number, and he was at the hospital. Also, in Serbia, you don't dial 911, so even if I could, I didn't know that's how I'd call the police. Anyways, he tells my mom she's to clean and to cook for him, and he takes me to the basement, where I was locked in what I now know is called the laundry room. I banged and cried and yelled, but it was so far down in the basement everything was muffled. For a week, we were kept in his home. He'd lock us up in the basement after my mom cooked him breakfast, and he'd let us out when he'd come back home at 4. If we had to use the restroom, there was a bathroom, but that was it. Just a bathroom and a laundry room. It was freezing cold down there, and even us huddling together under a blanket did nothing. One morning, I discovered a small window by climbing on some boxes. I managed to open it, and my mother insisted I squeeze through it. I didn't want to leave her, and besides, how would I get help? I couldn't read nor speak the language. However, I didn't want to live like this for the rest of my life, so I did as she asked. I ran once I got out, and I'm sure I was a sight. A scrawny boy with no shoes, only wearing shorts and a t-shirt in the middle of November. However, that is what saved us, as several concerned neighbors tried to get me to come to them, and I wouldn't. I was terrified. I kept trying to get them to follow me. The police were called, and a very nice policeman tried to get me to go into his car. Then I saw the man who'd taken us drive up in his taxi. He saw the police and took off. That's when I made a run for his house to get my mom. Needless to say, the cop and his partner ran after me and my mother was rescued. It took another 4 hours for them to find someone who spoke our language for us to tell them what happened. A warrant was issued for the man. My brother was contacted, and his friend had told him we had never showed, and my brother had been frantically calling back home in Serbia to find us. He drove up to get us and to give the cops information on his supposed friend so they could find him. But they never did find him. Back then, before 9/11, it was easy for someone to disappear. However, it made me distrustful for a long time of people and their intentions. My mom grew homesick and she ended up going back to Serbia. I stayed and finished school, and I ended up becoming a cop in the military, thanks to the nice officer that helped me all those years ago. I think of that guy who kept us prisoner every now and then, and honestly, I wouldn't mind meeting him now. I just don't think he'd want to meet me. This is a story about something that happened to me and my grandma when I was 6 or 7, so 2001 or 2002. For context, I'm a girl, and at the time I was living in a city that was somewhat small, but is politically important, so it always had an airport. My aunt was flying in, and as she had lived in another town for ages, we were very excited to welcome her at the airport. We made our way to the gate people came out of after picking up their luggage. Not sure if this has a name in English, but to describe it, it had sliding glass doors so you could see people inside getting the luggage. I remember being very chatty while waiting, and at some point my grandma grabbed my hand real hard and gave me a look that just said, "Shut up." I thought I had said something wrong, but after a while, I realized she was trying to listen to the people that were standing right next to us. They seemed to be fighting a lot. Also, my grandma has always been very gossipy. I looked over at them, and they were an old man and a very pregnant woman, and were just discussing something which didn't really interest 7-year-old me, so I ignored it. And now some things get fuzzy in my memory, so I will tell you what I remember and then what my grandma told me happened. I remember hearing the old man scream something like, "There he is, I'm going to get him," over and over until this man comes out of the sliding glass doors. Then I just remember that people all around started screaming, and my grandma threw me into the ground and laid on top of me. I heard noises like fireworks and screams, and I felt suffocated both by my grandma and some sort of weird smell, and also by how hot it was under her. So I was feeling really bad, and I started screaming. At one point, I tried to push her off of me, and for a moment, I raised my head and saw a lot of red close to my face, on the ground, and lots of people laying down, with hands on their heads. Everything smelled bad and hot. I don't really know how else to describe it. At this point, my grandma pushed my head quite forcefully to the ground and whispered, "Stop and play dead, now," in the most serious voice I had ever heard from her. I didn't understand what was happening before that, and I was quite angry with my grandma for being forceful. But as she said this, I began to understand that this was serious, and I got quiet really fast, while trying not to cry. At some point she got off of me and all, but carried me to stay behind a large pillar. I remember feeling very shaky in the legs, as if I had no strength, but there was a police officer there who told me everything was going to be alright. There were other people there who looked scared too, and we just sat down in silence for some time, while we heard police talking and an old man crying and screaming very loudly. Then it got really quiet, and I remember being taken to a room where I had to say what I knew to more officers for a while, until we could go. When they took me there, an officer used his hand to cover my eyes on the way, and I remember feeling just angry and tired of being handled around. I tried to take his hands off, and I saw for just a moment the pregnant woman lying on her back. This image is forever in my head since that day. Now, for the details my grandma told me later on. She told me what happened only a few years back. At the time this took place, she just explained to me that a very bad man did bad stuff, but he was arrested and I shouldn't worry. But as she explained recently, what happened was that the old man was the woman's father, and apparently she was very young and got pregnant by this guy. I'll call him Dick, who then just ran away and abandoned her. He was coming back because she had recently been in touch and had reconsidered about being a dad. Except when her father found out about this, he was very angry and decided to take revenge on Dick for leaving in the first place. My grandma said she learned this on the news later, but in the airport she heard the father talking about how Dick ruined her life, and how he had to pay, and how he wasn't going to let anyone treat her like that. And he kept telling him that she loved the guy, that he had come around to not do anything. I should add maybe that abortions aren't legal here, and that the only way to get one is either paying a lot of cash to someone to do it illegally, or getting sketchy drugs from sketchy people, which can result in a lot of other bad stuff. And as you may have guessed, her father had a gun, and as Dick came out of the glass door with his luggage, he whipped it out. And that's when people started screaming, and my grandma throws me on the ground, and also when everyone gets on the ground too. Except he didn't just kill that guy. Apparently he was too emotional, or he had never shot a gun before. Or both. Because he couldn't aim right, and he hurt some other people too, who took grazing bullets or got shot in non-fatal places. While this is happening, the woman keeps screaming that she loves her baby daddy, and when her dad managed to aim right, she threw herself in the way. Both her, Dick, and the baby got killed instantly. My grandma said that this happened really fast, and the police showed up right when he shot them. This is when the old guy calms down a bit, or at least isn't trying to shoot anyone anymore. So there's a lot of police trying to get the gun from him, and people start to get up and hide. This is when we go behind the pillar. It takes a few minutes, but finally he lets go of the gun. Probably sad at his daughter and grandchild's death, and the police take him finally. I think it took the police some time to show up, because at the time, it was a very small airport. Low on crimes and such. My grandma said the whole thing happened in maybe 20 minutes, but to me, it felt like ages. As I only talked to my grandma recently, I hadn't realized how close we had been to the old man and his daughter, and that when I saw red just a few inches from my nose, I probably saw someone who had been hurt, so close to me, and was putting myself in danger trying to push her off. I'm forever grateful that she protected me so well, and that I hadn't realized the situation we were in until recently. A little about me. I'm currently 22, and this happened when I was 10. I had a cell phone at the time, but only because my parents travel for their work, so I stayed with my grandparents while my parents were on the road. My dad was working a job in Austin, but my mom was home with me. I had a break going on in school, spring break, so my mom and I decided to fly down to Austin to see him. My mom is a smoker, and me being 10, she didn't want me in the cigar room in the airport, which was basically a glass box full of smoke. So we leave our gate and head down that way. Thankfully, there's a bookstore maybe 10 feet from the cigar room, which also has mostly glass windows. So my mom sends me to the bookstore and sits close to the door of the cigar room so she can see me. Before we parted ways, my mom told me to send her a text message saying, "I really want this book, if I got any bad vibes from anyone." Well, I am a reader, so I think I'll look for a while until my mom is ready to get me. There probably won't be any issue. After about 5 minutes of being in this bookstore, I notice a guy walk in. I really only remember his gray suit and black shoes. I notice his shoes come over by where I am, the thriller section, so I move away to another section, where he promptly follows me again. I assumed it was just coincidence, since I was still looking at more mature books, and I move over a few feet to another section, where they have books on racks in the middle of the floor, rather than on shelves in the wall. The guy moves over to the same rack I'm at, but the other side. My freakometer was going off like crazy, which is rarely wrong. So I do one last thing to test my theory of this guy, and I walk over to the little kid section, like Hungry Caterpillar type books, and the guy follows me again. I'm freaking out, so I go back to the thriller section, which is closest to the checkout desk, pick up a random book and text my mom. I really want this book. Not 2 seconds later, I smell my mom's perfume and hear her say, "Oh, good, you found something." We promptly pay and leave. Once we were away from the store, I told my mom what happened, and she told me she had seen the guy follow me across the store twice, and immediately walked over because her freakometer was also off the charts. She hadn't even gotten my message because she was already walking over. Before we go back to our gate, we stopped at the ladies' room, and I noticed the bookstore guy coming down that hall, and silently pointed out to my mom, who went on high alert. After the ladies' room, we head to our gate where we see the bookstore guy sitting 2 seats down from our luggage. So my mom sat down next to the plane entrance thing and grabbed our stuff. After we board our plane, the guy is only a couple rows away from us, We can't really move because, well, it's a plane. Finally, we have a layover midway between Nashville, our first airport, and Austin. I didn't notice the rest of this, but my mom did. The guy got off right behind us and followed us to our next gate. My mom was just pissed at this point and ready to throw down with this guy, but won't because I'm with her. We verify where our gate is and our next plane's ETA and take off to the smoking area, another glass box filled with smoke, where she brought me in with her and smoked the fastest cigarette ever. Apparently, the guy had followed us across the airport to the cigar room and just stood outside waiting. We stopped in a gift shop so I could get my dad a gift and grab a drink, and he followed us there too. Finally, my mom has had more than enough but isn't going to confront him personally because he hasn't done anything technically or engaged us in a very suspicious way yet. So we go back to our gate where my mom tells the lady by the plane entrance what's been going on since Nashville, and she called security. These two huge security guards come down to our gate and start talking to my mom, who says very loudly and pointing, "That man has been following us since we arrived at the airport in Nashville. He's making us very uncomfortable." After telling them the full story and hearing my mom being loud and seeing her pointing directly at him, the bookstore guy takes off running. So security called for backup and followed him, and like 2 minutes later, we boarded our plane for Austin without the creepy guy.
A few years ago, I was a bartender at Hooters. I worked until close most nights, which was at 1 a.m., and I would usually get out around 2. There was a Waffle House down the road that I would frequently stop at to eat after my shift. I was a recognizable regular because of my Hooters uniform, so I was well known among the staff. However, I never thought that I would owe them much more than a check for dinner. But one night, that changed forever. At about 9 p.m., a man sat down at the bar and ordered his first drink. He had an off-putting vibe, but far from the worst I've seen. He didn't say much, but I could tell he was checking me out whenever my back was turned. He stayed there for hours and ordered several drinks. During that entire time, nobody showed up to sit with him, and he made no effort to socialize with the other patrons at the bar. A minute before close, he finished his last drink and left without tipping. An hour later, I was freed from my shift and walked into the parking lot. I noticed a windowless white van parked in the lot. I knew it didn't belong to any of my coworkers, and all the customers should have been long gone. It gave me a bad feeling, but I didn't stick around to find out why. I made it to my car and drove down to the Waffle House for the meal I had been looking forward to all night. I walked in and sat down on my usual spot by the window. I made small talk with the waiter, but I didn't order. He knew exactly what I wanted, and so did the cook, who started making my food as soon as I walked in. Within a few minutes, I was served my meal, hot and fresh. I inhaled it ravenously. I hadn't eaten since I left the apartment. It was a while before I slowed down to take a breath, but when I did, I saw something that instantly made my stomach shrivel up. Out in the parking lot, just a few spaces from my car, was the exact same windowless white van I saw in the Hooters parking lot. I hadn't noticed it until then, but it was backed in and facing the restaurant, seemingly looking right at me. Suddenly, my food didn't taste good at all. I had a terrible feeling about that van. I tried to finish my food, but I lost my appetite. I waited for 15 minutes to see if the person in the van would get out to sit inside or pick up an order, but they never did. Finally, I decided I needed to get home, so I got up to pay. At the register, I asked the waiter to watch out for me as I left to make sure I got in my car. He had no problem with that. I left the restaurant and rushed to my car, then quickly pulled out of the lot. When I looked into my rearview mirror, I saw to my horror that the van had pulled out behind me. Terrified, I took the first turn I could. The van followed once again. At that moment, I knew I was being followed. I couldn't go home, but I couldn't drive around aimlessly trying to lose him and end up in a dead end somewhere. At first, I panicked. I just kept taking turn after turn, and each time the van followed me. Finally, I figured it out. I suddenly jerked my car into a random driveway without signaling. Then I backed out and turned around. Of course, the van pulled the same maneuver. I gunned it back to the Waffle House where I parked right in front of the door. Then I hurried inside. I got my first look at the man in the van as he got out and followed me in. I sat down in a booth by the kitchen and faced the door. The man who was following me sat in the booth next to mine and faced me, smiling at my panic and fear like the sick freak he was. The waiter came to me first, probably already aware that something was wrong. "Well, you're back early. You forget something?"
I came back for seconds. Could I borrow a pen?
"Sure thing." I grabbed the pen and frantically wrote a message on a napkin. I wrote that the man was following me and to call the police. I handed it to the waiter and he didn't miss a beat. "So you'll have the usual again?"
Yes, thank you.
"All right, let me get that started. I'll be right with you in 1 second, sir." The waiter walked to the phone and quietly called the police. Then he came back to take the creep's order. Then, it was just a waiting game. But I knew that was a bad thing. In the small town where I'm from, the police only care about speeding tickets. Their response time is abysmal, which gave the creep plenty of time to try talking to me. "So, you work at Hooters, huh?"
Yes, I do. You're very observant.
"Oh, yes. And I like what I'm observing right now."
Thanks.
"How do you like your eggs?"
Scrambled?
No. You gotta get them over easy. I love watching them pop and ooze when all the liquid runs down those soft, white curves.
Sir, I'm trying to have a meal in peace.
"Listen to me! You're gonna be in pieces unless you get in my car and come home with me, you understand?" From that moment on, I was unable to speak. Our food came out a few minutes later. I couldn't eat a single bite. I watched the man in front of me devour his plate without taking his eyes off me for a second. The wait seemed endless. The waiter came and took the creep's plate away, and it was still another 10 minutes before the police finally made it. And when they arrived, it was just a single deputy. He sauntered over to the waiter. As I watched the two of them talk, I couldn't hear them, but I could tell that the deputy was annoyed by the situation, as if concern for my safety was beneath him. In fact, he shrugged. Then he sat down on the other side of the restaurant and waved the waiter over so he could place an order. I was furious. I don't think the creep even noticed him. The waiter was the only one who did anything. He cashed the creep out at the table, and then to my surprise, he started to shout at him to get out. The creep resisted, but after a brief shouting match, he left the restaurant, got in his van, and waited for me. The waiter told me that he would go with me and make sure I wasn't followed. Together we went outside and I rushed into my car, shaking like a leaf. The waiter stood in front of the van, blocking him from getting out of the spot unless he wanted to run him over. Thanks to him, I was able to get home safely. It was a week or so before I had the courage to go back, but when I did, everything seemed fine. In the years since, I haven't seen that sicko once. I had asked the waiter what he said or did to drive him away, but he said he didn't want to talk about it, in a tone that let me know he never would. To this day, I owe a lot to the staff of that Waffle House, especially that waiter. If I had driven straight home from work, I don't know what would have happened to me. That waiter saved my life and spared me unimaginable suffering. Yet what infuriates me to no end is how that cop didn't even seem to care. It baffles me that I can rely on a waiter at Waffle House to keep me safe more than a cop. I used to be a cook at Waffle House. In the several years that I worked there, I managed to avoid experiencing any crazy encounters because I worked the morning shift. Unfortunately, that peaceful streak came to a disastrous end a few months ago. It was about 7:30 in the morning. I was just getting into my groove during the breakfast rush when a man barged into the restaurant. Everyone stopped what they were doing and turned their heads for a moment. His erratic demeanor immediately gave away that he was on something. He didn't say anything or sit down. He made a beeline for the bathroom and locked himself inside. My coworkers and I rolled our eyes. We knew he was probably going in there to use, and I don't mean the toilet. We gave him about 15 minutes before we knocked on the door and asked him to leave. When there was no response, We got the keys and unlocked the bathroom. We expected to see some crazed, strung-out man freaking out on the floor, but nobody was in there. Nothing at all except a pair of soiled pants and a wallet. We had no idea how he managed to get out the door with no pants on without anyone noticing, and somehow he locked the door after himself too. I felt like we shouldn't go back to work until we figured out where he was or how he got out, but the waitresses didn't care. They didn't want to lose out on their tips, and made a good point that they didn't get paid enough to deal with that. They had me take the soiled jeans out back to the dumpster while they mopped up. Then we held onto the wallet in case he came back for it. The next few hours were brutal. We had wasted 15 minutes not working during a rush because of the incident. Thankfully, things eventually slowed down. But that's when I started hearing strange noises coming from the ceiling, like there was a raccoon up there or something. I talked to my coworkers about it, but they brushed it off and told me to focus on work. I tried my best not to think about it, but something wasn't sitting right with me. When I got to take a bathroom break before the lunch rush, I was a bit hesitant to go in there, but I didn't have much of a choice. I sat down on the toilet, and then I noticed something odd. The ceiling tile above me was slightly out of place. I looked through the gap and saw a pair of eyes staring back at me. I freaked out. I pulled up my pants and ran out into the restaurant. I yelled at my coworkers to come look in the bathroom, but by the time I managed to get them over there, the tile had moved back into place. They looked at me like I was crazy and told me to get back to work. I begged them to believe me. I was concerned for their safety. If he could peep in the men's restroom, he could peep in the women's restroom too. But they wouldn't listen to me. I realized I was making a scene in front of the customers and knew I had to calm down. I went back to work. But the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time a customer went into the bathroom, I wanted to stop them, but I couldn't. It ate at me for hours. I knew there was a creep in the ceiling, but nobody would believe me. Slowly, my frustration turned to anger. By the time my shift was almost over, I had lost all my patience and snapped. I went into the bathroom and started shouting at the ceiling. I knew that psycho could hear me. I didn't care if everyone thought I was crazy.
Come down here, you freak! I know you're hiding up there! Don't make me come get you myself!
There was no answer, but I had to put an end to it. I locked the door so he couldn't escape. Then, I stood up on the toilet and popped the ceiling tile out. I reached down to get my phone so I could use the flashlight. But then, I was grabbed and pulled up into the ceiling. I fought back, and in the struggle, the ceiling collapsed, causing both of us to fall onto the bathroom floor. Immediately, the man put his hands over my mouth so I wouldn't scream.
Shut up! Don't rat me out! I can't let them find me. I haven't finished my mission yet.
I managed to push him off me and get to my feet. And that's when I saw he still wasn't wearing pants. But then he did something I never could have seen coming.
What's wrong with you? Why were you in the ceiling? Damn it! You gave away my position! Now I have to kill you! Ah!
He grabbed the sink and ripped it off the wall. I backed into the corner, dumbstruck by his unhinged strength. He raised the sink into the air like he was about to smash it over my head. But then I was saved by a knock at the door.
Hey! What's going on in there?
Help me! You idiot!
He threw the sink onto the floor. Then, he stood up on the toilet, started crawling back into the ceiling. I tried to drag him back down, but he kicked me so hard in the face that I hit the ground again. By the time the waitresses unlocked the door, he had disappeared into the ceiling. She saw the destruction in the bathroom and thought I was responsible for it. She grabbed me and pulled me through the restaurant, then tossed me into a booth. I was in too much shock to try to get out of her grasp. She started yelling at me and called the police to have me arrested.
You absolute moron! What the hell are you smoking? There's no man in the ceiling. There's just you being crazy.
No, I swear. Go look. I'm not crazy. There's really a man up there. Oh, God. He's moving. I could hear him moving around in the ceiling, but nobody else seemed to notice. I thought I might actually be going crazy. The way I was acting surely didn't help my case. My coworkers kept me in that booth until the police arrived. I was boxed in.
Come on, get up. We can make this a lot easier for you if you come willingly.
No, it's not me. Look in the ceiling. He's up there.
Of course, they didn't believe me either. But then, the ceiling started to creak loudly, right over our heads. Everyone looked up as the panels bulged. And then, all at once,
The whole thing came crashing down right on top of me. Everyone ducked out of the way, but the man landed right in my lap. Pants! Give me your pants! Get off me!
I kicked him to the floor where he scrambled to his feet before the police can make sense of what was happening and grab him. He managed to slip away and run out of the store with the police chasing after him. They eventually got him a few blocks away. Suddenly, I wasn't so crazy. Everyone apologized for not believing me, but the damage was done. For a few hours there, I really thought I was having a schizophrenic breakdown. I couldn't go back there and work with those people. The building needed extensive repairs anyway, so I quit. I work at Denny's now, doing the exact same thing I did at Waffle House. Except there's nobody falling through the damn ceiling. I drove from my hometown of Gary, Indiana to party with my girlfriends at a club in downtown Indianapolis. We thought about carpooling so we could stick together, but none of us thought the city could be as dangerous as Gary. After the club closed, we walked to our cars to get on our way home. But as soon as I sat down, I knew I wouldn't make the drive without something to eat first. Waffle House has always been my go-to choice for situations like this, so I found the nearest one on my phone about 10 minutes from downtown. When I got there, I realized I had put myself in a sketchy part of town. But again, I didn't think it could be worse than where I was from. Besides, I needed food and I didn't want to wait any longer. I went inside and sat at the bar. It was fairly busy, as a Waffle House usually is at 2 a.m. But everybody seemed to be minding their own business. I ordered what I always get, and a few minutes later, I was filling my empty stomach with some much-needed food. About halfway through my meal, a group of people entered the restaurant. I had a bad feeling about them just by the way they barged through the front door. They didn't say anything to the employees. They walked straight to the back of the diner where there was another group of people sitting at a booth. The group that entered immediately became hostile and started threatening people that were sitting down.
I thought we told you never to come through here again. You can't stop us from feeding ourselves. Like hell I can't!
The two groups went back and forth, getting more and more heated with every word. I was torn between playing it safe and leaving while I still could, or sticking around and seeing where this went. Shouting and fighting aren't uncommon in a Waffle House at 2 a.m., and from my experience, the shows could be pretty interesting. Unfortunately, things took a sudden turn for the worse. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw one person stand up from the booth, and then I saw someone else pull out a knife. I knew then that it was time to get out. I quietly laid a $10 bill on the counter, stood up, and calmly walked to the door. By the time I made it to the first door, the fight was becoming physical. It wouldn't be long before someone got cut, or worse. I pushed through the second door, but that's when I saw just how dire the situation was. A large, muscular man stood in front of the second door leading outside, blocking anyone from leaving.
Please, just let me get out of here. I don't have anything to do with this.
I tried to convince him to let me pass, but he wouldn't budge.
Doesn't matter. You don't see anyone else trying to leave, do you?
I looked inside. The fighting was getting nasty. A pile of violent people had formed on the table where it all started. Nobody could tell who was who anymore. The other customers watched, but nobody got up from their seats. Then, the first sight of blood spilled over the edge of the table. In a panic, I tried to push myself around the man who was blocking me, but it was pointless. He shoved me back into the glass behind me, and when I regained my balance, I saw that he had drawn a knife to prove his point.
Nobody's going in or out until we finished our business.
A moment later, the tiny thread of composure left inside the restaurant snapped as explosions rang out. At that instant, the deafening sound triggered a panic. I watched it form as every single bystander got up and rushed for the door. I glanced at the man at the door for a split second. His expression was the same. He was unaffected by the telltale noise. When I looked back inside, the mob had already reached the first door. In a split second, I joined in the panic and rushed toward the outside door. The guard shoved me back into the rushing crowd, which immediately surged me forward right back into him. That's when I felt the knife pierce my chest as I tumbled through the chaos, landing on the pavement outside. For the next few seconds, I was trampled by the stampede running from the danger. Then, quicker than it had all started, it was over. A handful of stragglers, I'm assuming the people who started the whole mess, ran out a few seconds after everyone else. The employees called 911, and I was the first to be rescued by the paramedics. The knife was still in my chest, which, while disturbing, apparently kept the bleeding from getting as bad as it could have been. I suffered a collapsed lung and a broken wrist, plus a dozen cuts and bruises, but I survived and made a full recovery. The same can't be said for everyone inside. One person unfortunately passed away from their injuries, and several more were severely injured. This all happened somewhat recently, so it will be a while before I eat at a Waffle House again. It'll be even longer before I step foot in Indianapolis. I always thought my hometown was the most dangerous place to be, but I was dead wrong.
I've been living alone for over 10 years now. My husband and daughter passed away, and the rest of my family moved out of town a long time ago. I've owned my house for 40 years and watched the neighborhood slowly fall apart, but I never would even thought of moving. The house, the yard, even the street are full of memories I will hold on to forever. Especially the old oak tree in my front yard. My daughter would climb up into it and spend the whole day playing in the branches. So when a man came knocking on my door and said he worked for a company that would cut it down for just a few $100s, I told him to go to hell. He tried to tell me the tree was dead, but I knew it wasn't. I still think he was just a scammer who didn't even have a real job. He got all pissy with me, so I slammed the door in his face. A few days later, a really bad storm front rolled in. It rained all day. In the evening, an awful thunderstorm hit. I wasn't too concerned about it. During that time of year, thunderstorms happen all the time. I wasn't prepared for anything, but I didn't think I needed to be. Just after the sun set, the power went out. Again, I wasn't too worried. I figured the city would get it fixed in the morning. I'd been watching TV, so I lit up some candles and read a book for a while. Not long after, I went to bed early. The storm was still raging, but it was peaceful. I'd always liked the sound of rain. Thunder never bothered me either, but that wasn't the only sound I heard out there. Right as I was getting into bed, I heard a chainsaw over the noise of the storm. I had no idea why somebody would be working outside with a chainsaw in that kind of weather. It sounded close, too, like it was coming from my neighbor's yard. I thought maybe he was working in the garage, but even then, that didn't make much sense. I expected the sound to stop after just a few seconds, but a whole minute went by and it never shut up. Finally, I just had to see what was going on. I got up and walked to my door, but I didn't even get a chance to open it. All of a sudden, this horrible cracking sound erupted outside. A moment later, the ceiling split open and the oak tree crashed right through it. The wall fell apart like tissue paper and the tree landed on my bed. If I had waited another 5 seconds to get up, I would have been crushed. I was in shock. The wind and rain were rushing into my bedroom. I was soaking wet almost instantly, freezing and confused. Then I looked outside through the hole the tree had created and saw in a flash of lightning a man standing by the tree stump with a chainsaw in his hands. Just as soon as I saw him, he started coming towards me. I was petrified in fear. He stepped over the tree and into my bedroom. Then he came right up to me, put the chainsaw right up to my throat, and then revved it.
Tell me where you keep your jewelry, you old hag!
Over there, in the dresser, in the locked drawer.
Open it, now!
I don't know where the key is.
Then find it before I cut your head off!
I can't. Everything's destroyed.
What do you mean? Are you senile? It's your house!
But look at it.
At last, he tore his focus away from me and looked at the destruction he had done to my bedroom. The roof was caved in all over the floor. It was impossibly dark. The tree had shattered the bed frame, and now everything I owned was being soaked by the rain. I don't know how he expected me to find anything in this mess he made, but I know he had to be out of his mind. Seeing how hopeless it would be to find the key to the drawer, he became furious. I thought he would turn back and rip me to shreds with the chainsaw, or cut my head off and throw it through the neighbor's window in anger. But instead, he shoved me to the floor and walked over to the dresser. He revved up the chainsaw and started cutting through the top of the dresser. He laughed as he did it, as if he was taking pleasure in destroying everything I had left. Mere seconds later, he had cut a hole through the wood and stuck his hand inside, pulling out my jewelry box. It also had a lock on it, of course, but he didn't care.
Please don't take it. It's all I have left.
Shut up! You don't need it! What's the point of putting jewelry on a disgusting old woman like you?
And that was the last thing he said before he ran out of the hole in the wall into the storm. I was left calling for help on my bedroom floor, but hardly anybody could hear me over the rain flooding my house. I expected God to strike me with lightning right then and there, but for some reason, he didn't. I lost everything that night. Those pieces of jewelry that were stolen had been in my family for decades, some of them generations. And all of that probably ended up in a pawn shop somewhere so that degenerate could get his next fix. It was so dark and chaotic when it was all happening, so I couldn't get a good look at his face. However, it would make sense to me if he was the same guy who tried to get me to pay him to cut down the tree a few days prior. I often wonder if I had fallen for that scam if things would have ended differently. Unfortunately, the police had not been able to find him, so on top of everything, I'll probably never get justice. I've been living in my neighbor's house ever since my home was destroyed. The community got together to try and raise money for repairs, but I don't know if it will ever be enough.
I spent a lot of time at my uncle's house when I was young. My parents worked a lot, and I can remember going to stay with my uncle's family most Fridays and staying till Sunday. At least until I was old enough to stay by myself. My aunt and uncle didn't really mind, and after a while, I began to think of their house and their family as more of a family than my parents. After all, my parents' house was just a house, and my uncle's was a place where people loved me and were glad to see me. My uncle had 2 kids, Ruth and Luke, and the 3 of us were all around the same age. Their room was in the basement, and we always hung out down there. They had an old TV down there, a Super Nintendo, and a VCR that we watched old movies on. The room was huge, the basement unwalled, so it made for a ton of space. We would sit down there all night playing games and watching movies and just loving life. This story happened when I was about 10, but it's something I'll never forget. It was Saturday. It had been raining all day. We'd been playing Super Mario World for about the 1000th time, and when lightning started, we were worried that they would tell us to shut it down. My aunt seemed to be worried that the lightning would ruin anything that was plugged in, and so we all figured that we'd just be reading or playing with toys in no time. To our surprise, they didn't remind us, and we didn't remind them. We were stuck in the forest level for a few hours, and I remember seeing the lightning flash in the little windows at the top of the wall. The basement had those little windows, short but long, and I sat and counted the minutes between flashes to see how far the lightning was from us. I remember squinting after one particularly bright flash, thinking I saw something as Luke put his tongue between his teeth and tried to get the ghost house to give up the right path. I leaned over the back of the couch, looking at the little window and waiting for another flash. There was definitely something there. Something sitting out near the window. But it was hard to tell as the rain came down and the fog covered the glass. It almost looked like a face, but that was stupid. No one would sit out in the rain and watch a couple kids just play Mario World. Luke growled as he accidentally ran Mario into a hole, said it was my turn. He had to say it a few times because I was so focused on the window that I didn't hear him at first. I turned back, Luigi waiting for me, and when the lightning flashed, I'd forgotten all about the face. Kids with short attention spans and all, am I right? We played for another 45 minutes before my aunt yelled down that it was time to get ready for bed. We groaned about getting just 5 more minutes, but my aunt said it was late and we needed our rest. When Ruth asked if we should watch The Land Before Time as we went to bed though, my aunt agreed. We grabbed our sleeping bags, brushed our teeth, and got into our jammies before getting comfy in front of the old TV set, slipping the tape into the battered old VHS. As the movie started, my aunt told us goodnight as she cut the lights. The lightning got closer, and I could see the flashes coming more and more often. The crashes shook the house, and it reminded me that I had been looking for something. I didn't see anything now, but I did hear a sound. It cut through the sleepy haze that I had been cultivating as the movie lulled me to sleep. Ruth was dozing, Luke was already snoring, and as Littlefoot and his friends made their journey to the Great Valley, I found that I just couldn't get that sound off my mind. It only came when the lightning did, and I could hear it on the edge of the thunder as it grumbled across the neighborhood. The longer the sound went on and stopped me from sleeping, the more frustrated I got. I got up finally and started listening, trying to pinpoint the sound to a specific place. If I could figure out where it was coming from, then I could tell myself it was nothing to be worried about and go to sleep. Luke and Ruth were already asleep, and I was tired enough that I wanted to just get this done with so I could go to sleep too. I waited for the lightning. I listened after the hard flash. As the thunder rolled, I heard it again. There it was, coming from the window near the washer and the dryer. I walked slowly into the little alcove, peeking at the window as I slowly came around the washer. I still couldn't tell, so I picked up one of the boxy little flashlights my uncle had on the utility shelf and waited for the flash. I turned the flashlight on, catching it fully in the face, and when I saw what was waiting outside that little window, it took everything I had not to scream like a banshee. Instead, I ran upstairs to get my uncle, telling him what was happening and that we were in danger. My aunt tried to tell me I was dreaming, but my uncle didn't seem so sure. He told me to go wake up my cousins and get them upstairs, and I nodded as he slipped on his house shoes. He was up and out the door in seconds, his stomach hanging over the top of his pajama pants, the rifle in his hand, hard to miss. I went down and got my cousins up, telling them we had to get upstairs, and when my aunt came down to help me, I could tell something had changed. I didn't know what my uncle had said to her, but she grabbed up Luke and made sure that Ruth and I were upstairs before she locked the basement door and set us up in the living room for the night. My uncle came back in 20 minutes later. He hadn't found anyone, but he still called the police. They came out and checked, asking me questions, and when they asked what I had seen, I told them. It was a face looking down through the window, a big rock raised as he tried to bash in the window. I found out later that those windows could be opened from the outside if the frame was bashed in just right. It was hard to do without a crowbar, but my uncle told me that if I hadn't caught the person, they would have been in after a few more lightning strikes. He says, to this day, that I probably saved my cousins and myself by being curious about a strange noise, and I'm welcome there anytime. My uncle installed new windows the week after the storm, and the new ones were sturdier and could only be opened from the inside. The police arrested a man a few weeks later for something similar, and I think we all slept a little bit better after that. I still wonder sometimes what would have happened if I hadn't caught that guy before he got in, and it's something I don't often like to dwell on. This incident goes back in time to when I used to work as a pizza guy for Domino's. It was mid of July. I was driving back after delivering the last order when the storm hit. If I was in a car, I would have pulled it down the road, waited for the storm to be over, but it was just an old scooter. My battery had already died down, so my only option was to find a shelter for the night. After 10 minutes into the storm, I found a house, drenched like a street dog. I knocked on its door. I knocked again this time, calling out, "Anyone home?" Still, no answer. Lightning flashed right behind me, so I turned around to check if my scooter was okay. And once I turned back, an old woman was standing in front of me with a creepy smile. "Whoa, hi," I fumbled because I didn't hear her open the door. Her eyes were grayish due to age, and she had 4 to 5 teeth left in her mouth. There was a bald spot on her head, with thinning hair going down to her shoulders. "I didn't order a pizza, but I won't mind a slice," the woman said. "No, ma'am. I was hoping to stop here for the night. I don't see any motels nearby, and my phone's..." Sure. Come on in." She led me into a living room that had a weird reeking smell. She told me to sit down and went to the kitchen. After about 5 to 7 minutes, she brought me a cup of tea and a towel to dry myself off. "I thought you might need this."
Huh? Oh, thanks. I'm sorry to bother you like this. Oh, no, dear. Not at all. Stay as long as you want. I've empty rooms upstairs. I've lived alone, so it won't be a problem. The woman took me to a room, and it was not bad. At least not for a night. She gave me a pair of loose pajamas and a Hawaiian shirt that she said belonged to her late husband. I locked the door and rested my head on the warm bed. Sleep came in seconds. I don't recall the time, but I woke up with a heavy head. It felt like I drank all the liquor in the world before going to sleep. God, why does my head hurt so much? I tried to get up from the bed, but my blurry vision made it difficult to see in the dark. I searched for the bedside lamp and turned it on. Once the lights hit the room, I felt dizzier. Before I could make sense of what was happening to me, a strong bile hit my throat and I vomited on the floor. It was the tea the old woman fed me. Suddenly, staying in that house didn't feel safer anymore. I somehow got up and changed back into my old clothes, even though they were soaking wet. The cold, wet clothes calmed me down, and I could think straight while suffering in this intoxicated state. The storm had stopped by then, and I could hear two voices coming from the other room. One was of the old woman, and the other was a man. Wait, didn't she say she lived alone? I placed my ear on the door to hear what they were saying. You sure he's asleep? The old man said. Yes, I gave him the tea myself. The stupid boy didn't even question it before drinking it. Oh God, there was something in that tea that made me unconscious. Why would she do that? You sure you're ready to operate? I might be in a wheelchair, but I'm still the best surgeon. I may prep for the surgery. What the frack? What kind of operation are they planning to do on me? I need to leave, right now. I quietly came out of my room. I could hear the metal clinks from their room now. I tiptoed down the stairs, but I found the main door locked. Damn, that old woman probably took away the key. How do I get out? I was panicking because something was very wrong about this house, about that senile couple upstairs. And just then, I remembered seeing an open window in my room. I ran back in and looked down from the window. I have to jump. There's no other way out. The rain has made the ground soft, so I can pray the fall doesn't hurt me much. I can hear the footsteps coming closer to my room. There was no more time to wait. I had to jump, so I did. I fell on my back and it bruised my arm, but the fear was way more than the realization of the pain. Somehow, I made it past the gate and started my scooter. Thank God my keys were in my pocket still. As I drove away, I heard a scream from the old woman. She probably just found out that I managed to escape. I never went back to that house ever again. Till today, I think how lucky I was that the tea wasn't strong enough to knock me down completely. Otherwise, who knows what that old couple was planning to do to me.
I was fresh out of a major breakup and struggling to get past the heartache when a friend of mine encouraged me to use Tinder. After one of my friends claimed to have massive success on the app, I decided to give it a go. After all, there was nothing left for me to lose. I would spend several hours swiping on matches to no end and getting no swipes back, making the whole experience seem even more depressing. Then I struck a luck. I swiped on a woman named Linda, and she finally swiped back on me. The match was a small victory that I would end up greatly regretting. We spoke for weeks on and off and got to know each other better. Linda seemed like a nice enough girl, though she was a bit older than me despite looking much younger. She wasn't fussed about going out for a meal or a trip to the cinema. The traditional romance wasn't her style, so we eventually arranged to casually meet up at a bar. Upon arrival, Linda was barely recognizable. Her profile picture was likely outdated, for the woman who faced me was a lot older and on the heavier side. This was an immediate red flag, though not exactly a major problem to me. We got our drinks and enjoyed each other's company. Conversation flowed effortlessly, and it seemed like we had a lot in common, maybe even too much. I got the impression that Linda perhaps somehow did her research on me. She tried to impress me by bringing up my exact interests. Whenever there came a moment of awkward silence, I would think about what to say, but she would beat me to it every time, eager to keep the conversation flowing. At one point, Linda looked at me and blatantly said, "Let's talk about sex," and I was stunned at her forwardness. She asked about my sex life and wanted to know what kind of stuff I got up to with previous partners. We exchanged stories, though mine didn't seem comparable to her exciting tales. Recounting her dramatic encounters, I felt ashamed and started making up stories just to seem less boring in contrast to her taste. I also felt immensely uncomfortable talking about these kinds of things on a first date. Just as I thought the topic was fading away, Linda began telling me about a disturbing experience she had that involved bondage. She unsolicitedly revealed that she liked to torture and abuse people for her pleasure. She told me one story in particular where she tricked a man into getting into bed with her, only for him to discover that the bed he laid down on was full of thumbtacks. After this revelation, I was gulping down my drink and reciting my excuse to leave. That's when she told me one final story. I was only partially listening, but apparently only a week before meeting me, she met up with a man that she met off Tinder and went home with him. She brought her bag full of bondage tools and ended up wrapping the man up from head to toe in cling film until he was mummified. She laughed while she retold the story and impersonated his mumbled pleas for help. "He's probably dead by now," she giggled and casually sipped her drink. I got up right then and left. I had no desire to entertain a deranged woman. I didn't question whether she was joking. It was simply inappropriate to speak of such things during a first meeting regardless. To top it all off, Linda tried to kiss me as I left, but I pulled away from her and stormed off before blocking her on everything. Needless to say, I'm done with Tinder, and I hope to never see Linda ever again. Unfortunately, this woman's story might be true, as it sounds directly connected to another chilling encounter shared by someone else on a different thread. This story gives additional information that could potentially be used by others to effectively avoid an encounter with this menacing woman. In Glasgow, Scotland, in November 2016, I became desperate for some kind of connection. I had been single for a long while, and I'll shamelessly admit, the loneliness was driving me crazy. That's when I met a very sweet girl online named Laura. She was in a hurry to meet me, and I was equally impatient. She made it clear that she didn't care for fancy dates and insisted we meet up at a pub. Now, I'm not exactly good looking myself, but I felt swindled when Laura showed up looking completely unlike what I had seen online. She had clearly used different pictures, yet it didn't overly upset me. I was just happy to finally have a date and decided to give her a chance to redeem herself. Laura was an overweight girl with long black hair. She wore her makeup like Amy Winehouse and claimed to be a big fan. In her thick eyeshadow and dark liners, she wasn't conventionally unattractive. We settled down and had a few beers before things started to get more intimate. I asked her about her hobbies and interests, and she wanted to know more about me. When I spoke of my job, she mockingly yawned and propped herself up with the sudden statement, "Let's talk about your sex life." As she said this, she slipped her foot out from her shoe and started rubbing it against my groin under the table. Being so deprived of touch, I was immediately aroused. I told her that it's been a while since I've been with anyone, and this seemed to excite her. When I returned to the question, she didn't waver in telling me that she had interesting kinks. "Want to see what I can do?" she suggested with a flirty wink. Normally, I handled my alcohol pretty well, but I was feeling drunk off my 4th pint and 2 earlier shots, so I accepted her invitation with clouded judgment. We headed outside and waited for a taxi back to her place. All the while, Laura held my hand and whispered provocative things in my ear. For some reason, I just felt like going to sleep. My head began feeling heavy and the ground beneath my feet shifted. I don't remember much after getting into the taxi with her, and my memory only returned in segments. I could recall falling down the stairs and Laura laughing at me, telling me to move my sexy ass up the steps. Then, I was in her bedroom naked, bound by my arms and legs, deeply aroused and confused. She entered the room in a bondage outfit and proceeded to perform sexual acts on me before having full intercourse. Despite how wrong the encounter felt, I was delighted and eventually dozed off for a bit. Not even a minute later, I was awoken again by a weird screeching sound. Laura was at the foot of the bed, busy wrapping my legs in cling film. When I asked her what she was doing, she smiled sinisterly. "Hush now, this is the best part." I was paralyzed and couldn't move a limb no matter how much I willed my body to. She continued wrapping me from my waist upwards until I began screaming at her to stop, and she stuffed my mouth with cling film to shut me up. The ball of plastic in my mouth made breathing difficult, so I tried not to hyperventilate and make it worse. In no time, I was completely wrapped from head to toe, not even able to see through the cling film on my face. I could hear Laura's muffled voice tell me that this was my punishment for being terrible in bed, and that I'd join her other victims, all whom she wrapped up and left for dead. When I sensed her leaving, I began thrashing around, screaming until I felt myself falling unconscious. Surprisingly, I woke up the next day, breathing clearly with people surrounding me. They had removed most of the cling film and successfully resuscitated me. Apparently, this wasn't Laura's flat, but an old-fashioned hotel room. The police were on the scene and questioned me, but I could only show them her Tinder profile, which she had already deleted. Although I'm grateful to my rescuers, I'll forever be embarrassed and traumatized by this incident. After the event, I began having panic attacks when I saw a resemblance to Laura in anybody I met. It took me years to pull myself together enough to trust people going on dates again, and the road to recovering mentally is still ongoing. I'm just glad to be alive, though I can't help but wonder if Laura's still out there claiming more victims, and my heart goes out to those who didn't manage to escape as I did. It was 2013. I was fresh out of college, where I'd studied journalism. I managed to get an intern position at a decent company, and I was shadowing this guy called Austin. He was a pretty talented reporter with a reputation that already preceded him. We'd been asked to try to find a good story on Tinder, which had just been released into the market. Austin, being the more experienced one, suggested we both download the app and start swiping. He wanted me to take notes of the sort of profiles I ran into, try to build an image of the average Tinder user, but pay special attention to the outliers. Days went by and I really saw nothing out of the ordinary. Austin, however, sent me a screenshot of a profile, a woman named Suzanne. Her age was listed as 29, but she was definitely an old lady. White fluffy hair, glasses, wrinkly skin, a proper grandma. Now that was unusual. I hadn't run into a single old person in the app until now. Not that old, at least. Trying to pass as 29 years old with a picture like that, too. I thought it might be a prank profile. Austin was hooked, though. He reached out to her, explaining he was a journalist trying to write an article on Tinder users, and wanted to know what motivated her to use the app. She gladly agreed, and Austin set a date for us to visit her at home. Sure enough, as soon as Austin rang the doorbell, the old lady from the photo opened the door for us, greeting us warmly. I noticed a long, thin scar running from right under her chin along her neck, something not really visible on her photo. The woman offered us some coffee as we sat down in her living room. Her space perfectly matched her appearance. Porcelain decorations, old-fashioned furniture, white, thin cloth curtains with elaborate embroidery at the bottom. Even the cups were fitting the aesthetic. As we drank the coffee, Austin initiated a bit of small talk, trying to get her more comfortable before getting to the proper questions. I didn't pay a lot of attention to it. I just overheard that she lived alone and had moved into the neighborhood around 15 years ago. My mind was elsewhere though. As my eyes had begun to wander around a bit, the whole place seemed to strike me as odd. Everything was so clean. Sure, the woman lived alone and she might have been a bit obsessed with cleaning, but it was more like brand new spotless. Even the old-fashioned furniture had no signs of wear. Austin decided to begin the interview. Suzanne was keen on answering every question, and also surprisingly adept at technology. As she spoke though, the odd feeling was there again. She didn't speak like an old person at all. She would use modern slang, and she seemed to have no trouble understanding social media lingo. Seeing such an old person speak like that so naturally was almost funny, but at the same time, somewhat unnerving. After a bit, Austin interrupted himself to ask for a coffee refill. Suzanne gladly obliged and left towards the kitchen. I had to almost suppress a gasp when this old woman stood up with no difficulty at all, straight posture, firm legs, and walked straight to the kitchen. Austin took the chance and told me that something was not right about her. I agreed, and he told me to excuse myself as soon as she came back. He wanted to get the chance to interview her by himself and see if he could bring out something really interesting. A few seconds later, Suzanne came back and I stood up, claiming they needed me urgently at the office. As soon as I got out, I felt the sudden urge to walk away as fast as possible. A shiver went down my spine, and the sense of dread started pressing on my chest. Something was seriously wrong there. I tried calling Austin, telling him he should get out of there, but he turned his phone off. I didn't go back for him. That was the last time I saw him. He never came back home after that. A police search was conducted in the area, but they found the house completely empty. A bit more investigation revealed it was a newly constructed property bought just a week ago. I try not to think about this very often. The only reason this story came back to me was because of what I found today on Tinder. As I swiped profiles, I came across a very familiar face. A young woman, 29 years old. Her eyes, the shape of her hair, the way her smile curved. I'd never met her, but I could swear I recognized her from somewhere. I saw her name, Suzanne. I held my breath as I closely examined the picture. Sure enough, on a closer look, I could see the thin scar running right from under her chin along her neck. I don't know what's going on. I guess she could be a relative, or someone who just happens to look like her, but the exact scar in the exact same spot? I'll try to make a police report. I closed the app as soon as I realized it was her, so I hope to find her profile again. Hopefully, it'll lead to some answers.
I live in Oklahoma, right in the middle of Tornado Alley. Extreme weather drills have been a frequent part of school life for decades, long before kids had to deal with all the other emergency drills. I went to middle school back in the 90s, and I have clear memories of huddling on the floor in the interior hallways of my school, with the lights off and my butt basically sticking up in the air, at least once a month for years. As a girl, I always felt uncomfortable, like I was exposing myself to all the teachers that were walking down the hall. But no matter what I said, I would be forced to follow instructions. I came to dread the extreme weather lockdowns more than the idea of a deadly tornado itself. A tornado might hit nearby once in a blue moon, but I felt like I had no choice but to moon all the weirdest teachers at school every month. Even worse, the lockdowns actually happened more often than that, because real extreme weather situations are very common during certain times of the year. One day in May of my 7th grade year, such a situation occurred. At the time, my classroom was one of the temporary buildings they put up around the school to alleviate overcrowding. Everyone called them portables, but they weren't portable. They were just flimsy buildings. That day, as the howling winds grew louder and the haunting wail of the tornado sirens droned on, and the chit-chat stopped, and a real sense of dread clouded over us. Initially, there was a morbid anticipation mixed in with it. I was a little excited to experience a real storm without having to be concerned about my home getting destroyed. I didn't care if the school got wrecked as long as I didn't get hurt, but it seemed unlikely that it would be like that. There was a part of me that actually hoped there would be a tornado. It would make showing my rear end to the weird chorus teacher worth it. The hope didn't last long, however. It was already dark inside, because the lights were off. But at the start, there was still natural light coming in from outside. Over the course of mere minutes, the storm began to block out the sun, until it felt like an unnatural night had descended upon the world. The winds continued to get stronger, shaking the doors like the storm itself was trying to beat its way in. Then the hail came, smacking against the door like a volley of meteors. Before long, the once quiet, hushed hallway was afflicted with a cacophony of noise. Fear gripped everyone. It was palpable. That's when the telltale sound whispered into our ears. Quiet at first. The low, grumbling, growing roar of rushing winds like a passing freight train, steadily intensifying as we all knew the monster was drawing near. It was undeniable by then, even if we couldn't see it, that a tornado was on the ground and not far away. And with every passing second, it seemed more and more certain that it would hit us directly. A lot of kids started to cry. The teachers yelled at us to stay calm, but they couldn't conceal the fear in their voices.
and the walls started to shake, they finally took cover too. For a few minutes, we were all equalized in this compromising position that was supposed to keep us safe, and now nobody had to be worried about anyone peeping at their crack. We all had greater concerns. The air itself vibrated at the frequency of a tornado. I could feel it in my chest. Outside, I heard carnage and destruction, debris slamming into the doors just to fly off into the distance in the next instant. It was like the world was getting shoved into a wood chipper. The most terrifying moment was when the windows couldn't take the stress anymore and shattered. A torrent of air rushed into the hall. The storm had finally found its way inside, and there's no more escaping it. It felt inevitable that the whole school was about to be ripped off its foundation, and all of us flung into the sky along with it. The procedure for anyone who found themselves in a portable at the time of a weather emergency was to immediately evacuate and take shelter in the main building of the school, leaving everything behind, including backpacks. Everybody got on the ground and covered their heads with their hands and sat in the most uncomfortable, awkward, and questionable position for much longer than we usually did in the drills. The teachers told us there was an extreme cyclonic thunderstorm with a high probability to produce tornadoes, heading straight for us, and that we wouldn't be allowed to get up and go back to class until it passed by. All of that was incomprehensible jargon to me at the time, but they are words I have since learned to take seriously. Most of the time, those lockdowns felt ridiculous and overdone. I clenched my teeth and I prayed. I'm sure we all prayed. Somehow, by God's grace, it worked. Just when we thought it was about to stomp on our heads, it began to grow quieter. At last, we could all breathe a sigh of relief. Over the next few minutes, all the growing signs of danger that preceded the tornado reversed and undid themselves, until the sun shined once again and the air was still. After waiting several more minutes to be safe, the lockdown was finally lifted, and we could stand up. My legs and back were sore, but I was unscathed. The school was intact, and I could go back to class and get my stuff. Except that wasn't entirely true. The main building was damaged, but still standing, I guess. But as I walked outside to the field of portables, I witnessed the true devastation that had just unfolded. The portables were just gone. Besides a bit of rubble and some pipes sticking out the ground, there wasn't a single trace left of them. Not even cinder blocks remained. Everything I had in my bag was erased. My scrapbook, my notebooks, my diary, all of it taken far away with no hope of having it returned. Knowing that if I had stayed in my classroom during the tornado, that I would surely have been utterly destroyed along with it, put a feeling in my chest I'll never forget. It's hard to describe realizing you've come so close to death at such a young age. Ever since then, I've never taken the threat of severe weather lightly. It is a part of my life in Tornado Alley, but I was born and raised in Oklahoma, and it's where I will stay.